The transmissions always came at exactly the same time, with the precision of an atomic clock. Mount Pilchuck rises 2,100 feet above the Cascade foothills, its granite summit, crowned by a Depression-era fire lookout that has guided hikers through the Snohomish County wilderness for nearly 90 years. The mountain draws its name from the Chinook word for red water, though the streams that cascade down its slopes run clear year-round. During winter months, when snow blocks the 5-mile access road, the peak becomes one of Washington's most isolated points, accessible only by snowshoe or ski. The Lookout Tower, built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1936, served as an active firewatch station until 1982, when modern aerial surveillance made the remote post obsolete. State parks acquired the structure and surrounding acreage in 1984, converting it into a day-use hiking destination. By 1987, the only permanent human presence consisted of a small ranger station at the trailhead, staffed seasonally by 2 part-time employees who monitored trail conditions and maintained basic facilities. It was here, in the modest ranger station, that the phenomenon first manifested itself through the crackle of standard-issue VHF radio equipment. On Tuesday, March 17, 1987, seasonal ranger David Kellerman was completing routine evening paperwork when his radio receiver activated at 3:47 a.m. The transmission lasted exactly 30 seconds. A monotone voice reading a sequence of numbers in groups of 4, followed by complete silence. Kellerman noted the incident in his daily log, assuming the broadcast originated from a nearby emergency services frequency or possibly a malfunctioning piece of equipment. The following Tuesday, the same transmission occurred at precisely the same time. Kellerman began recording the broadcasts, using a portable cassette recorder positioned next to the radio. The voice remained consistent, week after week, gender indeterminate, accent-free English, spoken at exactly 60 words per minute. The number sequences changed, but the format never varied. 12 groups of 4 digits, read without pause or inflection. No call sign preceded the transmission. No acknowledgement followed. When Kellerman reported the recurring broadcasts to Washington State Parks headquarters in Olympia, administrators initially suggested interference from Canadian radio operators, or possibly military exercises from Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, 40 miles northwest. However, both Canadian communications authorities and Navy personnel confirmed no scheduled transmissions in the area during the reported times. By summer, other park employees had witnessed the phenomenon. Maintenance supervisor Janet Reeves, working late inventory in the equipment shed, heard the same transmission through her handheld radio on Tuesday, June 23rd. Seasonal interpreter Mark Constable documented the broadcast while camping overnight at the Lookout Tower during a wildlife survey in early August. Each witness described identical details. The transmission began without warning, contained no static or interference, and ended with an abrupt return to silence. Signal strength remained constant, regardless of the receiver's location within a 3-mile radius of the summit. In October 1987, Washington State Parks contacted the Federal Communications Commission to investigate possible illegal broadcasting. FCC Enforcement Officer Patricia Henshaw arrived at Mount Pilchuck on Tuesday, October 13th, equipped with directional finding equipment designed to locate unauthorized transmitters. At 3:47 a.m., Henshaw's equipment detected the transmission emanating from a point approximately 1,200 feet southeast of the fire lookout, somewhere within the dense second-growth forest that blankets the mountain's upper slopes. The signal strength suggested a transmitter operating at moderate power sufficient to broadcast across several miles, but not requiring elaborate antenna arrays. Weather conditions were clear, with minimal cloud cover and no atmospheric disturbances that might affect radio propagation. Henshaw noted in her report that the transmission exhibited characteristics consistent with a ground-based broadcast originating from within a quarter-mile radius of coordinates 48.01 degrees north, 121.8 degrees west. At dawn, Henshaw began a systematic search of the indicated area. Her directional equipment led her through dense stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock, across steep granite outcroppings, and into ravines filled with sword, ferns, and moss-covered logs. She discovered no structures, cleared areas, or evidence of human activity beyond the established hiking trails. A follow-up search conducted the following week, with additional FCC personnel, yielded similar results. Ground-penetrating radar revealed no buried cables or equipment. Metal detectors registered only naturally occurring iron ore deposits common throughout the Cascade Range. Henshaw's final report, filed in November 1987, documented the recurring transmission, but concluded that standard enforcement procedures have failed to locate the source equipment. The case remained open but inactive, with no further investigation scheduled. The transmissions continued without interruption through 1988 and 1989. Park staff began referring to the phenomenon as the Tuesday Ghost, though official incident reports maintained clinical language describing unidentified radioactivity. In spring 1990, electronics engineer Robert McLeod from the University of Washington volunteered to conduct an independent analysis. McLeod spent 3 consecutive Tuesdays at Mount Pilchuck, recording the transmissions with professional-grade equipment and analyzing their technical characteristics. His findings confirmed earlier observations. The broadcasts originated from a fixed location, transmitted on a frequency of 154.4 MHz, and exhibited no variation in signal strength or audio quality. More significantly, McLeod determined that the voice displayed characteristics inconsistent with live speech: consistent pacing, identical pronunciation of repeated number combinations, and absence of breathing sounds or natural speech patterns. McLeod concluded that the transmissions were pre-recorded, likely generated by automated equipment programmed to broadcast at specific intervals. However, his attempts to locate the source equipment proved unsuccessful, despite employing increasingly sophisticated directional finding techniques. During his final night on the mountain, McLeod positioned himself within 50 yards of the calculated transmission point. At 3:47 a.m., he heard the familiar broadcast through his radio receiver, while simultaneously listening for any ambient sounds that might indicate nearby electronic equipment. The forest remained silent, except for the distant call of a great horned owl. By 1991, the Mount Pilchuck transmissions had attracted attention from radio enthusiasts and amateur investigators. Several independent monitoring stations in western Washington began recording the weekly broadcasts, comparing technical data, and attempting to triangulate the source location with greater precision. These efforts consistently pointed to the same general area on Mount Pilchuck's upper slopes. However, repeated searches by increasingly experienced teams produced no evidence of broadcasting equipment, concealed structures, or access routes that might indicate human presence. The phenomenon persisted without explanation through the decade, becoming an accepted routine for park staff and a minor curiosity for the small community of researchers who monitored the transmissions. New seasonal employees were briefed about the Tuesday broadcasts as part of their orientation, along with standard information about bear safety and emergency procedures. In late 1999, the transmissions ceased as abruptly as they had begun. The final broadcast occurred on Tuesday, December 21st, 1999, at 3:47 a.m. The format remained unchanged. 12 groups of 4 numbers read in the same monotone voice that had characterized the phenomenon for nearly 13 years. The following Tuesday, December 28th, produced only static. No explanation was ever provided for the cessation of the transmissions. FCC records contain no reports of equipment failures, license revocations, or enforcement actions in the Mount Pilchuck area during that period. Washington State Parks received no communications from individuals claiming responsibility for the broadcasts. The ranger station radio equipment continued functioning normally, receiving routine emergency services, traffic, and weather broadcasts without incident. Other monitoring stations throughout the region confirmed the permanent silence on the frequency that had carried the mysterious transmissions. Today, hikers ascending the Fire Lookout Trail pass through the same dense forest where FCC investigators once searched for broadcasting equipment that was never found. The lookout tower offers expansive views across Puget Sound to the Olympic Mountains, while 1,200 feet below, the coordinates that once marked the source of an unexplained signal remain notable only for their complete ordinariness. Douglas fir, salal, and the patient accumulation of decades' worth of fallen needles. Park rangers no longer maintain logs of radio anomalies, and the Tuesday night shift passes without incident. Yet in a climate-controlled archive in Olympia, dozens of cassette recordings preserve the voice that spoke numbers into the darkness for nearly 13 years. Originating from a location that extensive investigation proved to be empty forest. Sometimes the most disturbing mysteries are hidden in plain sight, filed away in the methodical precision of official records. The whole river valley cuts through the heart of Olympic National Park like a green cathedral, its ancient temperate rainforest sheltering some of the largest trees in North America. Sitka spruces rise 300 feet above carpets of moss and fern, while the whole river itself carries glacial melt from Mount Olympus through 47 miles of wilderness before reaching the Pacific Ocean. The valley receives over 12 feet of rainfall annually, creating an ecosystem so dense and primordial that early explorers compared it to walking through a living tunnel. Established as part of Olympic National Park in 1938, the Hoh River Valley remained largely unmapped in precise detail until the 1950s, when the National Park Service commissioned comprehensive topographical surveys to support visitor services and resource management. The terrain presented significant challenges for surveying teams: steep canyon walls, dense canopy coverage that obscured aerial photography, and weather conditions that limited visibility for weeks at a time. The valley's isolation was legendary, even among Park Service personnel. Beyond the visitor center and campground, established at mile marker 13 along the Hoh River Road, the wilderness extended unbroken for nearly 30 miles to the glaciated peaks of the Olympic Range. Indigenous Quinault and Quileute peoples had traveled through the valley for centuries, but their traditional routes followed ridgelines and game trails that avoided the deepest sections of old-growth forest. In spring 1952, the U.S. Geological Survey assigned 3 independent teams to map overlapping sections of the upper Hoh River Valley, ensuring accuracy through redundant coverage and cross-verification of findings. The first team, led by senior cartographer James Whitmore, began work on April 8, 1952, establishing base camps and conducting preliminary reconnaissance along established hiking trails. Whitmore's team specialized in hydrographic features, documenting the numerous tributaries, seasonal waterfalls, and wetland areas that characterize the valley floor. The second survey group, supervised by topographer Margaret Chen, arrived 2 weeks later with equipment designed to map elevation changes and geological formations. Chen's expertise in mountain terrain made her team responsible for documenting the transition zones, where the valley floor gave way to the steep slopes that eventually became the Olympic peaks. The third team, directed by cartographic engineer Robert Dalton, focused on creating detailed maps suitable for future trail construction and visitor access. Dalton's group carried the most precise surveying instruments available in 1952, including a Wild T2 theodolite, capable of measuring angles to within seconds of arc. Each team worked independently, following standard protocols that minimized contact between groups to prevent collaborative errors or unconscious bias in measurements. Radio communication was limited to safety check-ins every 48 hours, with detailed findings reserved for formal reports submitted after fieldwork completion. On May 16, 1952, all three teams completed their surveys and returned to the Park Service headquarters in Port Angeles to begin map preparation. When James Whitmore reviewed his field notes, he found detailed documentation of a small lake located approximately 2 miles upstream from the Hoh River Visitor Center. His notes described the body of water as roughly circular, approximately 400 feet in diameter, fed by a seasonal creek descending from the northern canyon wall. Whitmore had recorded water depth measurements, noting a maximum depth of 37 feet near the lake's center. Margaret Chen's topographical data included identical references to the same lake, positioned at coordinates that matched Whitmore's findings within acceptable margins of surveying error. Chen's notes described the lake as occupying a natural depression between two lateral moraines, consistent with glacial formation during the last ice age. She had documented the elevation as 218 feet above sea level. Robert Dalton's detailed survey contained the most comprehensive information about the lake, including precise measurements of its shoreline, calculations of surface area, and recommendations for potential trail access. Dalton noted that the lake's position made it an ideal destination for day hikers seeking a moderate wilderness experience without the demands of high-altitude climbing. The convergence of three independent surveys documenting identical geographic features should have simplified map preparation. However, when Park Service cartographers began compiling the final topographical maps, they discovered an inconsistency that would perplex administrators for decades. Despite detailed documentation from all three survey teams, aerial photographs of the Hoh River Valley showed no evidence of a lake in the specified location. High-resolution images taken during clear weather conditions in late summer revealed continuous forest coverage with no visible breaks, clearings, or reflective surfaces that would indicate standing water. Park Service administrators initially assumed the aerial photographs had been misfiled or incorrectly labeled. However, examination of multiple photographic flights conducted between 1949 and 1953 consistently showed the same result: dense forest coverage with no visible lake. Chief Cartographer William Morrison contacted all three survey teams for clarification. Whitmore, Chen, and Dalton were each asked to review their field notes and confirm their findings regarding the documented lake. The responses proved more disturbing than the original discrepancy. James Whitmore, reviewing his meticulously maintained field notes, found the detailed lake documentation, but claimed no memory of conducting the measurements or observations described in his own handwriting. He noted that the handwriting was unquestionably his own, and the surveying techniques recorded in the notes matched his standard procedures, but he maintained complete amnesia regarding any body of water in the upper Hoh River Valley. Margaret Chen expressed similar confusion when presented with her topographical data. She recognized her notation style and confirmed the accuracy of elevation measurements for surrounding terrain, but insisted she had never observed or documented any lake during her time in the valley. Chen noted that her team had worked methodically through the area in question, establishing multiple observation points that would have provided clear views of any significant water feature. Robert Dalton's response proved most unsettling. Not only did he deny any recollection of surveying a lake, but he insisted his team had specifically noted the absence of standing water in the documented coordinates. According to Dalton, the area contained dense old-growth forest with no clearings, depressions, or other features that might support a body of water. Park Service investigators examined the survey equipment used by all three teams, searching for malfunctions that might explain the documented measurements of non-existent features. All instruments passed calibration tests and had been maintained according to standard procedures throughout the survey period. Weather records for spring 1952 showed normal precipitation patterns, with no unusual atmospheric conditions that might affect visibility or create temporary water features. Stream flow measurements from the Hoh River indicated typical seasonal variations, with no evidence of drainage from undocumented tributaries. In September 1952, a follow-up survey team was dispatched to the coordinates where all three original teams had documented the lake. Led by senior geologist Dr. Franklin Hayes, the investigation team carried ground-penetrating radar, core sampling equipment, and precision GPS units to examine the area in exhaustive detail. Hayes' team found mature Douglas fir and western hemlock forest with understory vegetation typical of old-growth temperate rainforest. Soil core samples revealed no evidence of recent or historical flooding, sediment deposition, or other indicators associated with standing water. Tree ring analysis of the largest specimens showed continuous growth patterns spanning over 300 years, with no interruptions that would suggest periodic inundation. Ground-penetrating radar detected no subsurface features consistent with a former lakebed, underground water flow, or geological formations that might create seasonal pools. The terrain showed typical glacial till composition with no unusual drainage patterns or water retention characteristics. Most significantly, Hayes noted the complete absence of wetland vegetation, aquatic insects, or other biological indicators that would persist even after the disappearance of a temporary water feature. The final report, classified as administratively sensitive due to questions regarding surveying accuracy and professional competence, was filed in restricted Park Service archives with limited distribution. Official topographical maps of the Hoh River Valley were published without reference to any lake features in the disputed area. No explanation was ever provided for the consistent documentation of identical non-existent features by three independent survey teams using different methodologies and equipment. The incident was not reported in professional surveying journals, and none of the surveyors involved discussed the matter in subsequent interviews or professional correspondence. James Whitmore continued his career with the U.S. Geological Survey for 23 more years, participating in major mapping projects across the Pacific Northwest. Margaret Chen became a respected authority on glacial geology, publishing extensively on Olympic Peninsula formations. Robert Dalton supervised cartographic work for numerous national parks, earning recognition for precision and reliability. None ever again documented geographic features that failed to appear in aerial photography. Today, hikers following the established trails through the Upper Hoh River Valley pass through the coordinates where three experienced surveyors once measured the depth of water that was never there. The forest remains as dense and undisturbed as early explorers described, with no clearings, depressions, or other interruptions in the green cathedral that stretches unbroken toward the Olympic peaks. In climate-controlled archives, the original field notes persist detailed documentation of measurements, observations, and calculations, describing a lake that three professional cartographers swore they never saw. In a town built over burning coal, the absence of sound can be more disturbing than its presence. Centralia sits in the Chehalis River Valley of Lewis County, Washington, a logging community of fewer than 3,000 residents, surrounded by timber operations and steep forested hills. Founded in 1845 by George Washington Bush, one of the first African-American pioneers in the Pacific Northwest, the town grew around coal mining operations that supplied fuel for steamships and railroad locomotives throughout the late 19th century. By the 1920s, underground mining had created an extensive network of tunnels beneath Centralia's residential neighborhoods, some extending more than 200 feet below the surface. The Centralia mine fire began on May 21, 1962, when a routine burning of trash in the town dump ignited an exposed coal seam. Unlike the famous Pennsylvania mine fire that would later capture national attention, Centralia's underground blaze remained relatively contained, burning through abandoned mine shafts and isolated coal deposits without threatening surface structures or creating visible smoke. Local authorities sealed the affected tunnels with concrete barriers and clay backfill, declaring the fire extinguished in November 1963. For 15 years, Centralia returned to the quiet rhythm of a small logging town. Residents occasionally reported faint odors of sulfur near certain storm drains, and basement temperatures in some neighborhoods remained unusually warm throughout winter months, but these anomalies were attributed to residual heat from the sealed mine workings. The town's main industries shifted to timber processing and seasonal tourism, with the old mining district becoming a residential area popular with young families seeking affordable housing. The disturbances began during the exceptionally cold winter of 1978. On Tuesday, January 10th, 1978, Margaret and David Kowalski were awakened at precisely 2:19 a.m. by what Margaret later described as the sound of heavy machinery running somewhere far underground. The couple lived on Maple Street in a modest two-story house built in 1955. Directly above what historical records indicated was the former location of shaft number 7, sealed during the mine fire remediation 15 years earlier. David Kowalski, a shift supervisor at the Weyerhaeuser lumber mill, initially assumed the sounds originated from late-night logging operations or possibly snow removal equipment working the nearby state highway. However, when he stepped outside to investigate, the January night was completely silent except for the distant sound of wind through Douglas fir trees. The following Tuesday, the same phenomenon occurred at exactly the same time. Margaret Kowalski began keeping a detailed log of the disturbances, recording the precise timing and duration of each incident. The sounds consistently lasted between 12 and 15 minutes, always beginning at 2:19 a.m. and gradually fading without any apparent pattern. She described the noise as rhythmic and mechanical, resembling conveyor belts or mining equipment, but muffled as though coming from a great depth. By March, 3 other families on Maple Street reported identical experiences. Robert and Linda Hayes, living 2 houses east of the Kowalskis, began waking every Tuesday at 2:19 a.m. to the same underground machinery sounds. Their 8-year-old daughter, Jennifer, initially assumed the noises were part of dreams, until she mentioned them to a school friend whose family lived on adjacent Pine Street. The Pine Street residents, the Morrison family, and their elderly neighbors, Agnes and Walter Petrosky, had been experiencing the same weekly disturbances since late February, though they had not discussed the matter with anyone outside their immediate household. Agnes Petrosky, 73 years old and a Centralia resident since 1942, noted that the sounds reminded her of the mining operations she remembered from childhood, but deeper and more distant than the equipment had ever sounded during active coal extraction. Word of the shared experiences spread quietly through the affected neighborhood during spring 1978. Residents discovered that 17 families, all living within a 6-block radius of the former mining district, were experiencing identical sleep disturbances every Tuesday night. The affected households included the Hendersons on Oak Avenue, the young Campbell family who had recently moved into a rental house on 2nd Street, and 3 separate families living in the Hillcrest Apartments, a modest complex built in 1968 over the former location of the mine's surface operations. Each family described the same phenomenon, waking at precisely 2:19 a.m. to the sound of distant machinery running beneath their homes, followed by complete silence when they went outside to investigate. Dr. Patricia Vine, the town's only physician, began documenting the reports when patients started mentioning the sleep disturbances during routine medical appointments. Dr. Vine had practiced in Centralia since 1974 and was familiar with the community's medical history, including any health effects that might be related to the former mine fire. Her initial examination of affected families revealed no common medical conditions that might explain the shared sleep disturbances. Blood work showed normal hormone levels, ruling out melatonin or cortisol irregularities that could cause synchronized sleep pattern disruptions. Hearing tests conducted on both adults and children from the affected households detected no unusual sensitivity to low-frequency sounds or other auditory abnormalities. Dr. Vine noted that the families represented diverse demographics, ages ranging from young children to elderly retirees, varying occupations, no shared social activities or common dietary factors, and different lengths of residence in Centralia. The only consistent factor was geographic proximity to the former mining operations. In summer 1978, Dr. Vine contacted Washington State Department of Health to report the unusual cluster of sleep disturbances and request assistance with investigation. State health officials initially suggested the phenomenon might be related to environmental factors such as radon gas emissions from the sealed mine workings or low-frequency vibrations from distant industrial activity. Environmental testing conducted in August 1978 found normal radon levels in the affected neighborhoods, consistent with background radiation typical of Western Washington. Air quality measurements detected no unusual chemical emissions, and soil samples showed no contamination from coal dust or mining residue. Sound monitoring equipment was installed at 3 locations within the affected area during September 1978. The sensitive microphones, capable of detecting frequencies below the range of human hearing, recorded ambient noise levels every Tuesday from midnight until 4 a.m. for 6 consecutive weeks. The results contradicted all witness accounts. Sound monitoring data showed typical nighttime noise levels throughout the recording period, with no mechanical sounds, underground vibrations, or acoustic anomalies detected during the 2:19 a.m. timeframe when residents consistently reported machinery noise. Background recordings captured only normal residential sounds: heating systems, cycling, occasional traffic from Highway 12, and natural sounds from the surrounding forest. Lewis County Sheriff's Department began conducting periodic patrols through the affected neighborhoods on Tuesday nights, searching for possible explanations for the reported sounds. Deputies found no evidence of industrial activity, construction work, or other operations that might produce mechanical noise during the early morning hours. Sheriff John Michelson personally participated in several overnight observations, positioning himself within the affected area during the reported disturbance times. On Tuesday, November 21, 1978, Sheriff Michelson parked his patrol vehicle on Maple Street and waited with his windows down and radio turned off. At 2:19 a.m., several residents in nearby houses turned on their lights and some came outside, indicating they had been awakened by the familiar sounds. Sheriff Michelson reported hearing nothing unusual during the entire period, describing the night as exceptionally quiet, even for Centralia. The phenomenon continued with mechanical precision through 1979 and 1980. New residents moving into the affected area began experiencing the disturbances within weeks of establishing residence, while families who moved away reported the sleep interruptions ceased immediately after relocating to other neighborhoods or leaving Centralia entirely. Dr. Vine expanded her documentation efforts, conducting annual medical examinations of affected families and maintaining detailed sleep study records. Her findings consistently showed no health deterioration, no hearing damage, and no psychological stress indicators beyond the fatigue associated with weekly sleep interruption. In spring 1981, the Washington State Geological Survey conducted ground-penetrating radar analysis of the former mining district to determine if residual coal fires or structural instabilities might be creating underground movement or gas emissions that could affect sleep patterns. The survey revealed the sealed mine shafts remained intact, with no evidence of continued burning, structural collapse, or gas venting. Geological analysis confirmed that the underground fire had been successfully extinguished in 1963, with no subsurface activity detected in the intervening 18 years. The final radar mapping showed the tunnel network exactly as documented in 1963 sealing records, with concrete barriers holding securely, and no voids or passages that might allow air movement or sound transmission from deeper coal seams. On Tuesday, December 15, 1981, the last documented incident occurred. Margaret Kowalski, who had maintained the most detailed records of the phenomenon, woke at 2:19 a.m. to the familiar sound of underground machinery. She noted in her log that the noise seemed fainter than usual and lasted only 8 minutes instead of the typical 12 to 15-minute duration. The following Tuesday, December 22nd, produced no disturbances. The sleep interruptions never returned. No explanation was provided for the cessation of the phenomenon, just as none had been found for its occurrence. Families who had experienced weekly disturbances for nearly 4 years simply began sleeping through Tuesday nights without interruption. Dr. Vine conducted follow-up examinations 6 months later, finding that all previously affected residents reported normal sleep patterns with no lingering effects from the years of regular disturbance. Several families mentioned feeling oddly unsettled by the silence on Tuesday nights, having grown accustomed to waking at 2:19 a.m. The sealed mine shafts beneath Centralia remain undisturbed, their concrete barriers intact after more than 60 years. Modern seismological equipment detected no underground movement, no residual fire activity, and no structural changes that might explain why 17 families once heard machinery running in tunnels that had been permanently sealed since 1963. Today, some of the original residents still live in the same houses where they once woke to the sound of equipment that monitoring devices proved was never there. They sleep soundly through Tuesday nights, though a few admit to occasionally checking their clocks at 2:19 a.m., listening to the silence that has replaced the rhythm they lived with for 3 years and never understood. The Navy keeps meticulous records of everything except what it chooses to forget. Naval Air Station Whidbey Island occupies the northern portion of Whidbey Island in Puget Sound, a strategic military installation that has served as the Navy's primary Pacific Northwest flight training facility since 1942. The base sits on Alt Field, named for Commander William B. Alt, who was lost during the Battle of the Coral Sea. From its runways, generations of naval aviators have launched training missions over the complex waterways and mountainous terrain that define the region's challenging flying conditions. The installation's location provides unique advantages for military aviation: protection from severe weather by the Olympic Mountains to the west, clear sight lines across Puget Sound's shipping channels, and isolation sufficient to conduct sensitive operations without civilian interference. During the Cold War era, Whidbey Island hosted classified electronic warfare training, submarine detection exercises, and experimental aircraft testing that required absolute operational security. By 1963, the base had evolved into a sophisticated training complex, supporting multiple squadrons of A-3 Sky Warriors, A-4 Skyhawks, and various support aircraft. The facility maintained comprehensive radar coverage, advanced communications equipment, and detailed flight operations logs that tracked every aircraft movement within a 50-mile radius of the base. This systematic documentation made the events of September 14, 1963, particularly difficult to explain or dismiss. At 21:47 hours, radar operator Petty Officer Second Class Thomas Garrett detected multiple airborne contacts approximately 12 miles southwest of Whidbey Island, moving in formation across the southern approaches to Puget Sound. The contacts appeared on radar screens as 7 discrete objects, traveling at approximately 200 knots in a perfect diamond pattern. Garrett immediately contacted the Base Operations Center to verify scheduled flight activity in the area. Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, the duty operations officer, confirmed that no Navy, Air Force, or civilian aircraft were authorized to operate in the designated airspace during that time period. Morrison ordered Garrett to continue tracking the unidentified contacts while he initiated standard intercept procedures. However, before scramble orders could be issued, the radar contacts began exhibiting flight characteristics that defied conventional aircraft performance. The 7 objects simultaneously executed 90-degree direction changes while maintaining precise formation spacing. They accelerated to over 400 knots without any apparent transition period, then decelerated to complete stops that lasted exactly 60 seconds before resuming movement. More significantly, visual observers in the base control tower reported seeing lights corresponding to the radar contacts, 7 bright white lights arranged in the same diamond formation shown on radar displays. Chief Petty Officer Robert Chen, manning the control tower's observation deck, described the lights as significantly brighter than standard aircraft navigation lights, with no visible red or green position indicators that would identify them as conventional aircraft. The lights maintained consistent brightness despite changes in apparent distance and altitude, suggesting either unusually powerful illumination or unconventional light sources. At 22:15 hours, Morrison made the decision that would later complicate all official documentation of the incident. He attempted radio contact with the unidentified formation. Using standard aviation emergency frequencies, Morrison transmitted identification requests and airspace warnings to the unknown aircraft. The response proved unlike anything in his 15 years of naval aviation experience. The 7 lights immediately changed formation, shifting from a diamond pattern to a perfect line, extending north to south across approximately 3 miles of airspace. The transition occurred with mathematical precision, each light moving to its new position, along the shortest possible route, while maintaining constant speed and altitude relative to the others. Morrison transmitted a second radio call, requesting the aircraft identify themselves and state their intentions. The lights responded by forming a perfect circle, with 6 lights equally spaced around the perimeter and the 7th positioned at the center. Radar data confirmed that the formation changes matched exactly what visual observers were reporting. The objects maintained consistent altitude at 8,000 feet, while executing maneuvers that would require coordination impossible for conventional aircraft operating without extensive rehearsal. At Morrison's direction, Garrett began documenting the radar contacts with permanent recording equipment, capturing both the positions and flight characteristics of the unidentified objects. Simultaneously, Chen photographed the lights using a camera equipped with telephoto lens designed for long-range surveillance. For the next 43 minutes, Morrison continued radio transmissions using various frequencies and call signs. Each transmission produced immediate formation changes from the 7 lights, creating geometric patterns of increasing complexity, figure 8s, triangles, parallel lines, and configurations that required simultaneous coordination among all 7 objects. The precision troubled Morrison more than the apparent responsiveness to radio signals. Military formation flying demanded extensive training and practice to achieve even basic coordination. The maneuvers observed over Puget Sound suggested either unprecedented pilot skill or flight characteristics beyond conventional aircraft capabilities. At 23:31 hours, Morrison transmitted what would prove to be his final communication attempt, a direct challenge for the unidentified aircraft to land at Whidbey Island for inspection and identification. The 7 lights immediately began ascending, maintaining their circular formation while climbing at a rate that radar calculated as over 3,000 feet per minute. Within 2 minutes, the contacts had reached an altitude beyond the effective range of base radar equipment. The lights faded from visual observation simultaneously, disappearing as if controlled by a single switch, rather than individual aircraft navigation systems. Morrison's incident report, filed the following morning, documented the radar contacts, visual observations, photographic evidence, and recording equipment data in standard Navy format. The report was classified confidential and distributed to Pacific Fleet Intelligence, Naval Air Systems Command, and the Office of Naval Intelligence for analysis. However, within 72 hours, Morrison received orders transferring him to administrative duties at Naval Air Station Pensacola. Garrett was reassigned to communications school in San Diego. Chen received orders for sea duty aboard the USS Enterprise. The photographic evidence disappeared from base files before analysis could be completed. Recording equipment documentation was transferred to higher classification levels with restricted access. Morrison's incident report was removed from standard filing systems and never acknowledged in subsequent correspondence. By October 1963, no personnel remained at Whidbey Island who had participated in documenting or investigating the September 14th incident. New arrivals were briefed on standard operating procedures, with no reference to unusual radar contacts or formation light observations. The base's official flight operations log for September 14, 1963, shows routine training missions, with no notations regarding unidentified aircraft or unusual radar activity. Weather reports described clear conditions with excellent visibility, ideal for the observations that were no longer officially recorded. In 1997, Declassification Reviews released selected documents from Whidbey Island's Cold War operations. Among routine training reports and maintenance logs, researchers discovered a single reference to Inventory Event Whidbey 7, dated September 15, 1963. The document fragment contained no details about the nature of the inventory event, but noted that all primary documentation has been transferred to appropriate analytical facilities for comprehensive evaluation. No records indicate what analytical facilities received the documentation or what conclusions were reached. Attempts to locate Morrison, Garrett, or Chen for interviews about the September 14th incident proved unsuccessful. Military personnel records indicated that all three completed distinguished careers with no disciplinary actions or unusual assignment patterns following their transfers from Whidbey Island. None had ever discussed the events of September 14, 1963. In subsequent interviews, personal correspondence, or professional memoirs covering their naval service. Today, Naval Air Station Whidbey Island continues its mission as the Navy's premier electronic warfare training facility, conducting hundreds of flights monthly over the same waters where 7 lights once responded to radio transmissions with mathematical precision. Modern radar systems monitor every aircraft movement with digital accuracy, creating permanent records that ensure no flight activity goes undocumented. The skies above Puget Sound remain under constant surveillance, tracked by equipment far more sophisticated than the systems that recorded formation changes no longer found in official logs. Yet somewhere in the Navy's vast archives, a single reference to Inventory Event Whidbey 7 suggests that some observations remain too precise to explain and too well documented to completely erase. Some voices return from places where sound should never travel. Ruby Beach stretches along the Pacific coastline of Olympic National Park, where the temperate rainforest meets the ocean in a dramatic collision of ecosystems. Named for the reddish crystals embedded in its sand, the beach extends for nearly 2 miles between Destruction Island to the south and Abbey Island to the north. Massive sea stacks rise from the surf like ancient sentinels, their basalt surfaces carved by millennia of wave action into formations that create natural amphitheaters and sound chambers. The beach became part of Olympic National Park in 1938, preserving one of the most pristine examples of Pacific Northwest coastal wilderness. Indigenous Quileute and Makah peoples had traveled these shores for over 1,000 years, following seasonal patterns of salmon runs and shellfish harvests. Their oral traditions contained numerous references to voices among the sea stacks, though early ethnographers dismissed these accounts as metaphorical descriptions of wind and wave sounds. During the mid-20th century, Ruby Beach developed a modest reputation among photographers and naturalists for its dramatic tidal pools and the clarity of its acoustic environment. The absence of industrial noise and limited human activity created conditions where natural sounds, bird calls, wave patterns, and wind through the offshore rocks could be heard with unusual distinctness. This acoustic clarity made the phenomenon that began in September 1989 particularly disturbing for those who experienced it. Dr. Margaret Sutton, a marine biology professor from the University of Washington, was conducting tide pool research at Ruby Beach on September 23, 1989, when she first encountered what would later be documented as the Ruby Beach Echo Anomaly. Sutton had positioned herself approximately 50 yards from the nearest sea stack, photographing anemone colonies during the morning's incoming tide. While calling out species identifications to her research assistant, positioned near the parking area, Sutton heard her own voice responding from the direction of the offshore rocks. The response was not immediate. Sutton's voice returned exactly 12 seconds after she had spoken, carrying the same words she had just called out, but seeming to originate from somewhere among the sea stacks rather than from her assistant's location. Initially assuming her assistant was repeating her observations for confirmation, Sutton continued her work. However, when she later discussed the morning's research with her assistant, Dr. James Chen, she discovered that he had heard only her original calls and had never repeated any of her observations. Chen had been positioned approximately 200 yards from Sutton's location and confirmed hearing her voice clearly during the morning's work. However, he reported hearing only single vocalizations from Sutton's direction, with no echoes, repetitions, or other acoustic anomalies. Sutton documented the incident in her research notes, but initially attributed the experience to acoustic effects created by the sea stack's unusual geometry. However, her attempts to reproduce the phenomenon during subsequent visits proved unsuccessful. Over the following 6 months, Ruby Beach visitors began reporting similar experiences to Olympic National Park rangers. The accounts showed remarkable consistency. Individuals would hear their own voices repeated back to them exactly 12 seconds after speaking, apparently originating from the sea stacks, regardless of the speaker's position on the beach. Park naturalist David Morrison began documenting these reports in early 1990, creating a detailed log of incidents that would eventually span 5 years and involve over 40 separate witnesses. Morrison's documentation revealed several disturbing patterns. The phenomenon occurred only during incoming tides, when water levels were rising around the base of the sea stacks. Attempts to reproduce the effect during outgoing tides or at low tide consistently failed, suggesting a connection between water levels and whatever acoustic properties created the delayed echoes. More significantly, the 12-second delay never varied, regardless of the distance between the speaker and the sea stacks. Visitors positioned 20 feet from the nearest rocks reported the same delay as those standing 300 yards away on the upper beach, defying basic principles of sound travel and reflection. Morrison conducted informal experiments, timing the phenomenon with a stopwatch during multiple incidents. His measurements consistently showed delays of 12 seconds, plus or minus no more than half a second, a precision that suggested mechanical rather than natural acoustic effects. Retired physics professor Dr. Elizabeth Hayes visited Ruby Beach in May 1991 after reading Morrison's preliminary report in a regional naturalist newsletter. Hayes brought professional audio recording equipment and attempted to document the phenomenon scientifically. During a 3-day observation period, Hayes witnessed the echo effect twice. In both cases, her recording equipment captured only the original vocalizations, with no evidence of the delayed responses that she clearly heard during the incidents. Hayes described the experience as profoundly disorienting. While she could hear her own voice responding from the sea stacks with perfect clarity, her sensitive recording equipment detected nothing beyond normal wave sounds and wind patterns during the relevant time periods. More troubling was Hayes' observation that the returning voices carried emotional inflections that sometimes differed from the original speech. During one incident, a casual comment about weather conditions returned as what Hayes described as urgent or distressed, despite her original tone being conversational and relaxed. Local photographer William Chen, unrelated to Dr. James Chen, spent considerable time at Ruby Beach during the early 1990s, documenting the coastal landscape for a planned coffee table book. Chen reported multiple encounters with the echo phenomenon and noted that the returning voices sometimes contained words or phrases he was certain he had not spoken. During one incident, in July 1992, Chen called out to his photography assistant to adjust equipment settings. The voice that returned 12 seconds later contained detailed technical specifications that Chen insisted he had never vocalized, despite the voice being clearly recognizable as his own. Chen's assistant, positioned approximately 100 yards away, reported hearing only Chen's original equipment request with no subsequent echoes or repetitions. Olympic National Park officials contacted acoustic engineering specialists from the University of Washington to investigate the reported phenomenon. Dr. Robert McLeod conducted a comprehensive survey of Ruby Beach's acoustic properties during September 1992. McLeod's team used sophisticated sound measurement equipment to analyze how voices and other sounds behaved in the environment around the sea stacks. They documented normal acoustic reflection patterns, with sound waves bouncing off rock surfaces at predictable angles and returning to listeners within expected time frames. However, McLeod could not reproduce the 12-second delayed echoes reported by visitors. His team generated test sounds at various frequencies and volumes, using directional microphones to capture any unusual reflections or acoustic phenomena. The comprehensive acoustic survey revealed no geological or architectural features that might create the described effects. Sound travel times between various positions on the beach and the sea stacks corresponded to standard calculations based on distance and environmental conditions. McLeod's final report concluded that the beach's acoustic environment was entirely normal, and noted that no scientific explanation could account for the reported phenomenon based on conventional understanding of sound physics. Despite the failure of scientific investigation to document or explain the echoes, incident reports continued reaching park officials through 1993 and into 1994. Morrison's log eventually contained 43 separate accounts from visitors who experienced their own voices returning from the sea stacks with the characteristic 12-second delay. The reports ceased abruptly in late 1994. Morrison's final documented incident occurred on October 15th, when a Seattle family reported hearing delayed echoes during an afternoon beach walk. No subsequent reports were filed, despite Ruby Beach continuing to attract thousands of visitors annually. Morrison retired from the National Park Service in 1996 and donated his complete documentation of the Ruby Beach echo phenomenon to the University of Washington's archives. The materials include detailed incident reports, witness contact information, and his own theoretical notes attempting to explain the acoustic anomaly. When contacted for follow-up interviews in the early 2000s, several of the documented witnesses confirmed their experiences, but expressed reluctance to discuss details publicly. Most requested anonymity and declined to participate in any formal study of the phenomenon. Dr. Margaret Sutton, whose research experience had initiated the documented investigation, continued her marine biology work at various Pacific Northwest locations. In a brief written response to inquiries about Ruby Beach, she confirmed her 1989 observations, but noted that she had moved on to research questions with more conventional parameters. Today, Ruby Beach remains one of Olympic National Park's most popular coastal destinations, attracting photographers, naturalists, and casual visitors who come to explore its dramatic tide pools and towering sea stacks. Park rangers provide standard safety briefings about tide conditions and marine hazards, with no reference to acoustic anomalies or unusual sound phenomena. The sea stacks continue their ancient dialogue with wind and waves, creating the natural symphony of coastal erosion that has shaped this landscape for millennia. Yet somewhere in university archives, 43 incident reports document a period when some voices found their way back from places where echoes should never have traveled, carrying words that speakers swore they had never said in tones they were certain they had never used. The most unsettling mysteries are often hidden in the methodical precision of bureaucratic records. Roslyn sits in the Cascade foothills of Kittitas County, a former coal mining town that once supplied fuel for the Northern Pacific Railway's transcontinental operations. Established in 1886 by the Northern Pacific Coal Company, the community grew rapidly around the Number 3 mine, which produced high-grade bituminous coal from seams extending deep beneath the Cascade Mountains. At its peak in the early 1900s, Roslyn supported over 3,000 residents, representing 24 different nationalities drawn to Washington Territory by promises of steady mining work. The town's layout followed the practical geometry of industrial necessity. Company housing lined Pennsylvania Avenue in orderly rows, while commercial buildings clustered along First Street to serve the miners and their families. The Northern Pacific Railway constructed a branch line from the main transcontinental route, connecting Roslyn's coal production to the broader rail network that carried fuel to locomotives operating between Seattle and the Midwest. This railway connection required significant infrastructure, loading facilities, maintenance shops, water towers, and passenger services for workers traveling between Roslyn and other mining operations. By 1890, the town possessed all the standard elements of a railroad terminus, including what company records indicated was a substantial depot building constructed to serve both freight and passenger operations. The building's importance to Roslyn's economic life seemed evident in the detailed documentation that survived in Northern Pacific Railway archives, stored at the Minnesota History Center. Following the railroad's merger with Burlington Northern in 1970, Dr. Patricia Henley, a transportation historian from Central Washington University, discovered the Roslyn Depot records in 1976 while researching branch line operations for her doctoral dissertation on coal transportation in the Pacific Northwest. Henley's archival research revealed comprehensive documentation of a depot that the Northern Pacific Railway had apparently operated in Roslyn from 1890 until 1923. The records included construction specifications, maintenance logs, staffing schedules, and detailed passenger manifests covering over 3 decades of operation. According to the archive documents, the Roslyn Depot was a substantial brick structure, measuring 60 feet by 30 feet, with separate passenger and freight facilities, telegraph equipment, and living quarters for the station agent. Construction records indicated the building was completed in September 1890 at a cost of $8,400, representing a significant investment in permanent infrastructure. Maintenance logs showed regular upkeep through 1922, including roof repairs, window replacement, and foundation work that suggested a well-maintained facility in continuous use. Passenger manifests documented thousands of travelers passing through Roslyn, with detailed records of destinations, ticket prices, and baggage handling that demonstrated active commercial operations. Most significantly, the records contained personnel files for 11 different station agents who had supervised depot operations between 1890 and 1923, complete with employment dates, salary information, and performance evaluations typical of railroad administrative documentation. Intrigued by this evidence of substantial railway infrastructure in what had become a small mountain community, Henley traveled to Roslyn in summer 1976 to photograph the depot building for her dissertation. She found no trace of any railroad station. Henley's initial survey of Roslyn revealed a compact downtown area with several original buildings from the mining era, including the company's store, which had been converted into a museum, and numerous residential structures dating to the 1890s. However, no depot building existed anywhere in the town, nor could she find any foundation, remnants, structural debris, or other physical evidence that such a building had ever been constructed. Consulting with local residents, Henley encountered a response that proved more disturbing than the simple absence of the documented building. Martha Peterson, 83 years old in 1976, had lived in Roslyn since childhood and maintained detailed knowledge of the town's history and former structures. When Henley showed Peterson copies of the depot records, the elderly woman insisted that no railroad station had ever existed in Roslyn. Peterson's account was supported by her brother James, age 79, who had worked for the Northern Pacific Coal Company for over 40 years before retiring in 1958. Both siblings maintained comprehensive knowledge of Roslyn's industrial infrastructure and were regarded by other residents as unofficial town historians. According to the Peterson siblings, coal transportation from Roslyn had been handled through loading facilities located directly at the mine entrance, approximately 1 mile from the town center. They insisted that passenger service to Roslyn had never existed, with workers and their families traveling to the nearest passenger station in Cle Elum, 7 miles to the south. When Henley presented the detailed passenger manifests and station agent personnel records, both Peterson siblings expressed confusion, but maintained their certainty that no depot had ever operated in Roslyn. They noted that such a substantial building would have been a central feature of the small community and impossible to forget or overlook. Henley expanded her research to include other longtime Roslyn residents who might remember the depot or its removal. She interviewed 12 additional families with multi-generational ties to the community, seeking anyone who could recall the building that Northern Pacific records indicated had operated for over 30 years. Every interview produced the same result: complete denial that any railroad depot had ever existed in Roslyn. Frank Kowalski, whose father had emigrated from Poland to work in the No. 3 mine, insisted that his family had always used the station in Cle Elum for railroad travel. Mary Benedetto, whose Italian immigrant parents had settled in Roslyn in 1892, maintained detailed knowledge of every significant building constructed during the town's peak years, but had no memory of any depot. Most troubling was the discovery that several residents possessed photographs of Roslyn's downtown area dating to the early 1900s. These images showed the locations where depot construction records indicated the building should have stood, but revealed only vacant lots or small residential structures with no evidence of major railway infrastructure. Henley contacted the Northern Pacific Railway's successor company, Burlington Northern, seeking additional documentation or explanation for the discrepancy between archived records and physical evidence. Railroad officials confirmed the authenticity of the documents Henley had discovered, but could provide no information about the depot's construction, operation, or eventual disposition. More significantly, Burlington Northern's corporate records contained no documentation of the depot building's removal or demolition. Standard railroad practice required detailed records of infrastructure disposal, including salvage operations, site restoration, and property transfers. No such documentation existed for the Roslyn Depot. Engineering surveys conducted by Burlington Northern in the 1960s as part of track maintenance planning showed no evidence of former depot facilities in Roslyn. The surveys noted loading structures associated with coal operations, but documented no passenger facilities or substantial railway buildings. Henley arranged for ground-penetrating radar surveys of the locations where construction records indicated the depot should have been built. The surveys, conducted by University of Washington archaeological specialists, revealed no buried foundations, structural debris, or other subsurface evidence of major construction. Soil analysis showed no disturbance patterns consistent with building, construction, or demolition. The investigated areas contained typical forest soil composition, with no evidence of the excavation, concrete work, or utility installation that would be associated with a 60-foot by 30-foot brick building. Most disturbing was the complete absence of artifacts that would typically persist after building demolition brick fragments, window glass, metal hardware, or other construction materials that would remain in soil even decades after structure removal. The Washington State Historical Society, contacted for additional perspective on the mystery, confirmed that their records contained no references to a railroad depot in Roslyn. Historical photographs in the Society's collection, including images used for tourism promotion and mining industry documentation, showed Roslyn's railway infrastructure limited to industrial loading facilities with no passenger depot. Yet the Northern Pacific Railway archives contained over 200 pages of detailed documentation regarding a depot that appeared to have never existed, complete with precise construction specifications, decades of maintenance records, and personnel files for station agents whose employment could not be verified through any other source. Henley's dissertation, completed in 1978, included a brief chapter on the Roslyn Depot mystery, but offered no explanation for the contradiction between comprehensive documentary evidence and complete physical absence. Her academic advisor suggested that the records might represent planned construction that was never completed, but this theory could not account for 33 years of operational documentation. The mystery deepened when subsequent researchers attempted to contact the 11 station agents named in Northern Pacific personnel files. Genealogical research revealed no evidence that any of these individuals had ever existed. Social Security records, census data, and vital statistics contained no references to the names listed in railroad employment files. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, death certificates, and other official documents that would document the lives of 11 people employed over 3 decades could not be located in any state or federal archive. Today, Roslyn functions as a small mountain community popular with tourists exploring the region's mining history. The town's museum displays photographs, artifacts, and detailed documentation of coal operations, railroad connections, and the diverse immigrant communities that shaped the area's development. No exhibits reference a passenger depot, and museum staff members have never encountered visitors asking about railroad station facilities. The Northern Pacific branch line that served Roslyn's coal operations was abandoned in 1963, leaving only scattered railbed remnants and the memory of an industrial transportation network that once connected the town to markets throughout the Pacific Northwest. In climate-controlled archives in Minnesota, over 200 pages of detailed documentation continue to describe 33 years of depot operations in a town where longtime residents insist such a building never existed. The records remain as methodically precise and bureaucratically complete as any other railroad administrative files, distinguished only by their description of infrastructure that apparently was never built, staff members who apparently never lived, and passengers who apparently never traveled to a station that was never there. Some trains run on schedules that were never published and carry passengers to destinations that don't appear on any map. Stampede Pass cuts through the Cascade Mountains at an elevation of 3,948 feet, serving as one of the Northern Pacific Railway's most challenging mountain crossings. The pass takes its name from an 1881 incident when a surveying party's pack animals stampeded during a winter storm. But the route itself had been used by indigenous peoples for centuries as a seasonal crossing between the Columbia River Plateau and Puget Sound lowlands. Construction of the railway tunnel through Stampede Pass began in 1886, requiring nearly 2 years of dangerous work in unstable rock formations and extreme weather conditions. The completed tunnel, stretching 2,570 feet through solid granite, opened in May 1888 as a crucial link in the transcontinental route connecting the Great Lakes to Pacific Northwest ports. By the 1960s, the pass carried dozens of freight trains daily, hauling timber, agricultural products, and manufactured goods across the Cascades. The route's elevation and exposure to Pacific storm systems created some of the most severe winter conditions on the entire Northern Pacific system, with snow accumulations frequently exceeding 6 feet and temperatures dropping below 0 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks at a time. These harsh conditions required specialized equipment and experienced crews familiar with mountain railway operations. Train movements through Stampede Pass followed rigid schedules designed to minimize exposure to weather hazards. With most freight traffic concentrated during daylight hours, when visibility and communication were optimal. The precision of these schedules made the anomalous sightings that began in December 1962 particularly disturbing for railroad personnel working the mountain crossing. Locomotive engineer Frank Morrison was leading an eastbound freight consist through Stampede Pass on December 18, 1962, when his headlight illuminated what appeared to be a passenger train stopped on the tracks approximately half a mile ahead. Morrison immediately applied emergency braking, bringing his 47-car freight train to a controlled stop roughly 300 yards from the stationary consist. Standard safety protocols required him to radio the dispatcher in Yakima to report the track obstruction and request instructions for proceeding. However, when Morrison attempted radio contact, he discovered that the passenger train was moving, traveling eastbound at what appeared to be normal passenger service speed, despite showing no rear-end markers or other safety equipment required for nighttime operations. Morrison's radio report to Yakima described a streamlined passenger train consisting of approximately 6 cars, fully illuminated from end to end, with interior lighting visible through windows along the entire length of the consist. The train showed no external identification markings, railroad logos, or route designations that would indicate its ownership or destination. Most significantly, Morrison noted that the passenger train was traveling at 11:47 p.m. on a route section where no passenger service had operated since 1958, when the Northern Pacific discontinued the last regular passenger runs over Stampede Pass. Yakima dispatcher Robert Chen confirmed Morrison's radio report and immediately checked all train movements authorized for the Stampede Pass route during the relevant time period. No passenger equipment was scheduled or authorized to operate on the mountain crossing, and no freight trains were using passenger car configurations that might explain Morrison's observations. Chen contacted the Burlington Northern Dispatcher in Seattle, as well as coordination centers for the Great Northern and Milwaukee Road Railways, seeking any explanation for unauthorized passenger equipment on the Stampede Pass route. All reported no missing or misrouted passenger consists that could account for the sighting. Morrison was instructed to proceed eastbound with caution, maintaining radio contact and reporting any additional observations. When his freight train reached the location where the passenger consist had been observed, Morrison found clear tracks with no evidence of recent train passage, other than his own approaching headlight beam on the rails ahead. Weather conditions were ideal for observation: clear skies, no precipitation, and visibility unlimited by fog or atmospheric conditions. Morrison's experienced crew, including conductor James Walsh and brakeman David Chen, confirmed the passenger train sighting and expressed confusion about its sudden disappearance from tracks that showed no evidence of side-tracking or routing to alternate lines. Over the following 18 months, similar sightings were reported by 6 additional train crews working the Stampede Pass route. All encounters occurred during late evening or early morning hours, typically between 11:30 p.m. and 12:15 a.m., and all involved eastbound passenger consists with identical characteristics. Locomotive engineer Patricia Hayes reported the most detailed observation during a February 1964 crossing. Hayes described a 6-car passenger train with what appeared to be a streamlined diesel locomotive, traveling at approximately 60 miles per hour, in perfect condition, despite heavy snowfall that had been accumulating for over 12 hours. Hayes noted that the passenger train showed no accumulation of snow on its roof or sides, suggesting either that it had recently departed from covered facilities or that it was generating sufficient heat to prevent snow adhesion. However, no passenger maintenance facilities existed anywhere along the Stampede Pass route, and the nearest covered passenger equipment storage was located over 100 miles away in Seattle. More disturbing was Hayes' observation that the tracks behind the passenger train showed no disturbance in the snow cover. Despite heavy overnight accumulation, the rails where the train had passed remained clear of snow, as if recently maintained by track equipment. but no maintenance operations were scheduled or authorized during the relevant time period. Conductor Margaret Santos, working with Hayes during the February sighting, noted that the passenger train's windows were illuminated with what appeared to be normal interior lighting, suggesting occupied passenger compartments. However, the consist moved without stopping at any of the established stations or sidings along the route, indicating either express service or through movement to destinations beyond the immediate area. Most significantly, Santos observed that the passenger train produced no visible exhaust plume despite sub-zero temperatures that would normally create substantial vapor clouds from diesel locomotive operations. The absence of exhaust steam suggested either unusually efficient combustion or propulsion methods, different from standard railway equipment. Northern Pacific Railway officials conducted a comprehensive investigation of the reported sightings during spring 1964. Operations Manager William Hayes interviewed all train crews reporting passenger consist encounters and reviewed radio communication records, maintenance logs, and equipment movement reports for potential explanations. The investigation confirmed that no passenger equipment was authorized to operate over Stampede Pass during any of the reported sighting times. Furthermore, no passenger consists were missing from inventories maintained at Seattle, Spokane, or Portland facilities that might explain unauthorized movement through the mountain crossing. Weather records for the sighting dates showed conditions that would prevent most unauthorized train movements, heavy snow, sub-zero temperatures, and visibility restrictions that would make unsupervised operations extremely dangerous. Yet crew reports consistently described ideal visibility and clear observation conditions during encounters with the unidentified passenger train. Railroad police investigated the possibility of equipment theft or unauthorized use of stored passenger consists, but comprehensive inventory checks revealed no missing cars, locomotives, or other rolling stock that could account for the observed train formations. More troubling was the discovery that track inspection records showed unusual wear patterns on sections of the Stampede Pass route where passenger train sightings had been reported. Rails showed polishing and wear characteristics consistent with regular passenger service, despite no scheduled passenger operations for over 6 years. Burlington Northern Railway, which had assumed control of Northern Pacific operations, requested that the Federal Railroad Administration examine the reported sightings as potential safety violations involving unauthorized equipment operations. FRA investigators conducted detailed interviews with reporting crew members and reviewed all documentation related to the incidents. The federal investigation concluded that train crew reports were consistent and credible, but could identify no passenger equipment or operations that might explain the sightings. FRA officials noted that the described train movements would violate numerous federal safety regulations if they involved actual passenger service, but no evidence existed to support enforcement action against any specific railroad or operator. Most significantly, the investigation revealed that similar reports had been filed by railroad personnel working other mountain crossings throughout the Pacific Northwest, suggesting a pattern of unidentified passenger train operations across multiple railway routes during winter months. The sightings at Stampede Pass continued through 1969, before declining in frequency during the early 1970s. The final documented report was filed by locomotive engineer Robert McLeod on January 23, 1971, describing an eastbound passenger consist matching previous crew observations, but traveling at reduced speed through heavy snowfall. McLeod's report noted that the passenger train appeared to be struggling with track conditions, moving at approximately 25 miles per hour, compared to the normal 60 mile per hour speed observed in earlier sightings. The train's interior lighting appeared dimmer than previously reported, and McLeod observed what he described as less distinct window illumination, suggesting reduced passenger occupancy. No subsequent sightings were reported after 1971, coinciding with the discontinuation of most passenger rail service in the Pacific Northwest. as Amtrak assumed responsibility for long-distance passenger operations in May 1971. Railroad personnel who reported the passenger train sightings continued their careers with various railway companies as the industry consolidated during the 1970s and 80s. When contacted by railway historians researching the incidents, most confirmed their observations, but expressed reluctance to discuss details publicly. Frank Morrison, the engineer who filed the first report in 1962, worked for Burlington Northern until his retirement in 1984. In a brief written response to historical inquiries, Morrison confirmed his Stampede Pass observations, but noted that he had moved on to more conventional train handling assignments. Today, BNSF Railway operates freight service through Stampede Pass using modern diesel locomotives and computer-controlled traffic management systems. The route carries over 40 trains daily during peak shipping seasons, monitored by GPS tracking and automated safety systems that document every train movement with electronic precision. Winter operations continue to challenge railway crews with heavy snow accumulations and extreme cold. But modern equipment and improved weather forecasting have eliminated most weather-related service interruptions. Train schedules are maintained with digital accuracy, and no unauthorized equipment movements have been reported since the implementation of computerized traffic control. Yet somewhere in railway archives, incident reports from the 1960s document a passenger train that maintained its own schedule through mountain winters, carrying passengers to destinations that appeared on no timetables and leaving tracks clear of snow in weather that should have made any train movement impossible. Sometimes nature's most fundamental laws bend in ways that measurement can document, but science cannot explain. Lake Chelan stretches 55 miles through the North Cascade Mountains of Washington State, carving a narrow channel between granite peaks that rise over 8,000 feet above its surface. Formed by glacial action during the last ice age, the lake reaches a maximum depth of 1,453 feet, making it the third deepest natural lake in the United States and one of the deepest in North America. The lake's extraordinary depth and mountain setting create unique environmental conditions that have fascinated limnologists since systematic study began in the early 20th century. Fed primarily by snowmelt from the Cascade Range and the Chelan River system, the lake maintains remarkably clear water, with visibility often exceeding 60 feet. Its narrow profile, rarely more than 2 miles wide, and steep underwater topography create an environment where normal lake physics operate under extreme conditions. Indigenous Chelan peoples had inhabited the region for thousands of years before European contact, developing sophisticated understanding of the lake's seasonal patterns, fish populations, and weather influences. Their oral traditions contain numerous references to the lake's unusual characteristics, including descriptions of water that held heat from the Earth's heart during winter months, when surface ice formed along the shoreline. These traditional accounts gained scientific relevance during the 1970s when state environmental agencies began comprehensive monitoring of Washington's major water bodies to assess industrial impacts and establish baseline ecological data. Dr. Margaret Chen, a limnologist with the Washington State Department of Ecology, established the first systematic temperature monitoring program for Lake Chelan in January 1976. Chen's research focused on thermal stratification patterns, the natural layering of water temperatures that occurs in deep lakes as seasonal changes affect surface conditions, while deeper waters remain relatively stable. Standard limnological theory predicted that Lake Chelan would exhibit typical thermal behavior, surface waters warming during summer and cooling during winter, while deep waters maintained more consistent temperatures year-round. The lake's extreme depth suggested that bottom temperatures should remain close to 4 degrees Celsius regardless of surface conditions, following established principles of freshwater thermodynamics. Chen's initial temperature profiles, conducted monthly at 12 established monitoring stations along the lake's length, revealed results that contradicted fundamental principles of lake thermal behavior. Beginning in March 1976, Chen's measurements consistently showed that water temperatures increased with depth, reaching their highest readings at the lake's deepest points. Surface temperatures followed expected seasonal patterns, but readings taken at depths exceeding 1,000 feet were consistently 4 to 6 degrees warmer than surface measurements. During winter months, when surface temperatures dropped to near freezing levels, deep water temperatures remained above 10 degrees Celsius, a differential that defied standard thermal layering models. More disturbing was Chen's discovery that the temperature inversion remained consistent regardless of seasonal changes, weather patterns, or other environmental variables that normally influence lake thermal behavior. Chen initially attributed the anomalous readings to equipment malfunction or calibration errors. However, repeated measurements using different instruments and verification procedures confirmed the unusual temperature gradients. Cross-checking with temperature monitoring equipment at other Pacific Northwest lakes showed normal thermal behavior, suggesting that the instrumentation was functioning correctly. By summer 1976, Chen had documented the temperature inversion across all monitoring stations, indicating that the phenomenon affected the entire lake rather than localized areas that might be influenced by underwater springs or geological activity. Dr. Robert Hayes, a thermal dynamics specialist from the University of Washington, joined Chen's research team in September 1976 to investigate potential explanations for the temperature anomaly. Hayes brought specialized equipment designed to measure heat sources, including underwater sensors capable of detecting geothermal activity or other subsurface energy sources. Hayes's initial surveys revealed no evidence of underwater hot springs, volcanic vents, or other geological features that might explain the elevated deep water temperatures. Seismic monitoring detected no unusual underground activity, and chemical analysis of water samples showed no mineral concentrations consistent with geothermal heating. More significantly, Hayes observed that the temperature inversion violated conservation of energy principles. The amount of heat required to maintain deep water temperatures at observed levels would require a continuous energy source, equivalent to a substantial industrial heating system, but no such source could be identified anywhere in the lake's watershed. Local resort operators and longtime residents provided additional perspectives that complicated scientific analysis. Marina operator Frank Morrison, whose family had operated boat services on Lake Chelan since 1948, reported that deep water fishing conditions had changed during the mid-1970s. Morrison noted that fish species typically found in cold, deep waters, lake trout and mountain whitefish, had become scarce in areas where they had previously been abundant. Conversely, species preferring warmer water, bass and perch, were being caught at depths where they had never been found before. Commercial fishing guide Patricia Santos, who had worked Lake Chelan waters for over 20 years, observed similar changes in fish distribution patterns. Santos reported that her depth finder equipment, which relied on temperature gradients to locate fish, had become unreliable during the period when temperature inversions were most pronounced. Most disturbing was Santos's observation that lures and fishing equipment retrieved from deep water felt noticeably warm to the touch, despite being submerged in what should have been near-freezing water during winter months. The Washington State Department of Ecology expanded temperature monitoring efforts in 1978, installing automated recording equipment at multiple depths to gather continuous data rather than relying on periodic manual measurements. The automated systems confirmed Chen's findings, documenting consistent temperature inversions throughout the monitoring period. Federal environmental agencies became involved in 1979 when the unusual thermal conditions were identified as potentially significant for regional ecosystem management. The U.S. Geological Survey conducted comprehensive hydrological studies, examining groundwater flows, surface water inputs, and geological factors that might influence lake temperature patterns. USGS investigators confirmed that no conventional heat sources existed in the Lake Chelan watershed. Groundwater temperatures were consistent with regional norms. Surface streams carried typical mountain snowmelt temperatures, and no industrial or human activities in the area could account for the thermal anomaly. Most troubling was the discovery that satellite thermal imagery showed no unusual heat signatures around Lake Chelan. Despite documented water temperature inversions, satellite-based infrared sensors detected surface temperatures consistent with other high-elevation lakes in similar geographic settings. The discrepancy between direct water temperature measurements and satellite thermal data suggested either systematic errors in ground-based monitoring or thermal phenomena that operated below the resolution threshold of satellite sensors. Dr. Elizabeth McLeod, a theoretical physicist from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, reviewed the accumulated temperature data in 1981 as part of a feasibility study for potential geothermal energy development in the Cascade Range. McLeod's analysis confirmed that the Lake Chelan temperature inversions violated thermodynamic principles unless an unidentified energy source was providing continuous heating to deep water layers. McLeod calculated that maintaining the observed temperature differential would require approximately 12 megawatts of continuous thermal input, equivalent to a substantial power plant operating exclusively to heat lake water. No energy source of such magnitude existed anywhere in the region. More significantly, McLeod noted that the temperature patterns showed no variation or decay over the 6-year monitoring period. Natural thermal anomalies typically fluctuate in response to seasonal changes, geological activity, or other environmental variables. The Lake Chelan inversion remained remarkably constant, suggesting either artificial heating or previously unknown natural processes. In early 1983, Washington State allocated significant funding for a comprehensive, multi-year study of the Lake Chelan thermal anomaly, including advanced underwater exploration, geological surveys, and installation of permanent monitoring stations designed to identify the heat source responsible for the temperature inversion. The research team assembled to conduct the expanded study included specialists in thermodynamics, underwater geology, and theoretical physics from multiple universities and federal agencies. Equipment, procurement, and initial site preparation began in March 1983, with fieldwork scheduled to commence during summer months when weather conditions would permit extensive underwater operations. However, when researchers conducted preliminary temperature profiles in April 1983, they discovered that the thermal inversion had completely disappeared. Temperature readings throughout Lake Chelan showed normal thermal stratification patterns consistent with standard limnological models. Deep water temperatures matched theoretical predictions based on the lake's depth and geographic location. No trace remained of the thermal anomaly that had persisted for over 6 years. Follow-up measurements conducted monthly throughout 1983 confirmed that Lake Chelan had returned to normal thermal behavior. Surface and deep water temperatures fluctuated according to seasonal patterns, with no evidence of the unusual heat sources that had characterized the lake during the previous monitoring period. Fish populations gradually returned to their traditional depth distributions. Fishing guides reported that depth finder equipment resumed normal operation. Deep water fishing equipment retrieved during winter months felt appropriately cold, matching expected water temperatures. No explanation was ever provided for either the appearance or disappearance of the thermal anomaly. Environmental monitoring continued through the 1980s and 90s, consistently documenting normal lake thermal behavior, with no recurrence of temperature inversions. Today, Lake Chelan functions as a popular recreational destination and remains subject to ongoing environmental monitoring as part of Washington State's water quality assessment programs. Temperature data collected over the past 4 decades shows consistent thermal patterns matching established limnological models for high-elevation mountain lakes. The sophisticated monitoring equipment installed during the 1980s continues to document normal seasonal temperature variations, with deep water temperatures remaining stable near 4 degrees Celsius year-round. Satellite thermal imagery shows surface temperature patterns consistent with other Cascade Range lakes of similar depth and elevation. Yet in climate-controlled archives in Olympia, 6 years of temperature data document a period when Lake Chelan's deepest waters remained mysteriously warm through mountain winters that should have chilled them to near freezing. The measurements remain as precisely recorded and scientifically valid as any other environmental data collected by state agencies, distinguished only by their description of thermal behavior that appeared suddenly, persisted without explanation, and vanished as completely as if the laws of physics had simply forgotten to apply. Some arrangements in nature are too precise to be accidental and too complex to be explained. Sequim Bay lies along the northeastern shore of Washington's Olympic Peninsula, a shallow inlet protected by Dungeness Spit and fed by the Dungeness River as it flows into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The bay's unique geography creates one of the most biologically diverse intertidal environments in the Pacific Northwest, with extensive tide pools hosting over 200 species of marine life across rocky shelves that extend nearly half a mile during extreme low tides. The area's name derives from the Sklallam word squim, meaning quiet water, reflecting the bay's reputation as a sheltered harbor that provided safe anchorage for indigenous canoes, and later, European vessels navigating the often turbulent waters of the strait. Archaeological evidence indicates continuous human habitation for over 4,000 years, with middens and tool fragments suggesting sophisticated understanding of the bay's seasonal patterns and marine resources. During the late 19th century, Sequim Bay supported a small but prosperous fishing industry, with salmon canneries and oyster cultivation taking advantage of the protected waters and rich nutrient flows from Olympic mountain watersheds. The bay's extensive tide pool systems became popular destinations for marine biology education, attracting researchers from universities throughout the region, who used the accessible intertidal zones to study Pacific Northwest coastal ecosystems. This scientific interest in Sequim Bay's marine environment made the phenomenon that began appearing in 1985 particularly noteworthy for the small community of researchers and local residents familiar with the area's natural patterns. Commercial fisherman David Morrison first noticed the unusual arrangements during an early morning check of his crab traps on September 14, 1985. Morrison had been working Sequim Bay waters for over 15 years and possessed detailed knowledge of tide pool locations, seasonal changes, and the typical distribution of shells, driftwood, and other materials deposited by daily tidal cycles. During what should have been a routine inspection of gear placed near the bay's eastern shore, Morrison discovered that debris in several large tide pools had been arranged into geometric patterns, shells forming perfect spirals approximately 6 feet in diameter, with pieces of sea glass positioned at precise intervals along the spiral arms. Morrison initially assumed the arrangements were the work of beachcombers or amateur naturalists conducting some form of educational project. However, the precision of the patterns and their location in tide pools accessible only during extreme low tides suggested either remarkable dedication by human arrangers or some previously unobserved natural process. More disturbing was Morrison's observation that the arrangements appeared to incorporate materials from different tidal zones, including deep-water shells and glass fragments that would not normally be deposited in the shallow pools where the patterns were found. Morrison documented the incident with photographs and reported his observations to the Sklallam County Marine Resources Committee, which coordinated with local researchers to investigate potential explanations for the unusual arrangements. Over the following 18 months, similar patterns were reported by 7 additional observers, including recreational fishermen, beachcombers, and marine biology students conducting field research in Sequim Bay. All reports describe geometric arrangements of natural and artificial materials, shells, sea glass, driftwood, and occasionally fishing debris formed into spirals, triangles, and complex symmetric patterns. Dr. Margaret Hayes, a marine biologist from Peninsula College, began systematic documentation of the phenomenon in March 1986 after receiving multiple reports from reliable local sources. Hayes established a monitoring protocol involving weekly surveys of known tide pool areas and photographic documentation of any unusual arrangements discovered. Hayes's research revealed several disturbing patterns in the reported incidents. The geometric arrangements appeared approximately once per month, typically discovered during the lowest tides when the most extensive tide pool areas were exposed. The patterns showed mathematical precision that would be difficult to achieve through random natural processes or casual human intervention. More significantly, Hayes observed that the arrangements incorporated materials that marine current patterns would not naturally deposit in the locations where they were found. Heavy shells from deepwater species appeared in shallow pools, while lightweight materials were sometimes found in positions that would require protection from wave action to maintain their placement. Local photographer William Chen, who had documented Sequim Bay's seasonal changes for over a decade, provided additional perspectives on the phenomenon. Chen reported discovering pattern arrangements during pre-dawn photography sessions when human activity in the area was minimal, suggesting that the formations occurred during nighttime hours when the bay was effectively deserted. Chen's time-lapse photography, conducted during several overnight periods in late 1986, revealed no evidence of human activity in tide pool areas during the hours when arrangements were believed to form. His cameras recorded normal tidal cycles, occasional wildlife movement, and weather conditions, but captured no images of people or equipment that might explain the geometric patterns. Most disturbing were Chen's observations regarding the materials used in the arrangements. Detailed examination of photographs showed that some patterns incorporated sea glass and shell fragments that appeared to have been modified or shaped to fit specific positions within the geometric designs. Natural sea glass typically exhibits random edges and surfaces created by wave action over time. However, materials found in the Sequim Bay patterns sometimes showed precise curves or angles that suggested deliberate shaping rather than natural weathering processes. The Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife assigned marine biologist Dr. Robert McLeod to investigate the reported phenomena in summer 1987. McLeod's comprehensive survey included detailed analysis of tide pool ecosystems, current patterns, and biological processes that might explain the formation of geometric arrangements. McLeod's investigation confirmed that no known marine organisms in Sequim Bay exhibited behavior patterns that could create the reported arrangements. While some species, hermit crabs, sea stars, and various mollusks actively moved materials within their environment, none possessed the capability to organize debris into complex geometric patterns, extending across areas of several square yards. Current flow analysis revealed that tidal patterns in Sequim Bay followed predictable cycles that would tend to disperse rather than concentrate materials in organized arrangements. The bay's protected location reduced wave energy that might create unusual deposition patterns, making the geometric formations even more difficult to explain through natural hydrodynamic processes. More troubling was McLeod's discovery that the arranged materials showed no evidence of biological activity that would indicate prolonged exposure to marine environments. Shells and sea glass found in geometric patterns lacked the algae growth, barnacle attachment, or other biological indicators that would be expected on materials residing in tide pools for extended periods. Chemical analysis of arranged materials revealed salt concentrations and mineral compositions consistent with recent ocean exposure, suggesting that the items had been moved to tide pool locations shortly before pattern formation rather than accumulating gradually through normal tidal deposition. The University of Washington's Oceanographic Research Division became involved in the investigation during 1988, when reports of the Sequim patterns attracted attention from researchers studying unexplained marine phenomena throughout the Pacific Northwest. Dr. Elizabeth Santos led a team that conducted comprehensive monitoring using motion-activated cameras, seismic sensors, and automated data collection equipment. The university research team documented 3 separate pattern formations during their 6-month monitoring period, confirming that the arrangements occurred without human intervention during nighttime low-tide periods. However, despite sophisticated surveillance equipment, the team captured no images or data that revealed how the materials were moved or organized into geometric configurations. Seismic monitoring detected no unusual vibrations, electromagnetic anomalies, or other physical phenomena that might indicate mechanical processes responsible for moving and arranging tide pool materials. The formations appeared to occur during periods of minimal natural activity, with no correlation to weather patterns, marine life behavior, or tidal variations beyond the timing of extreme low tides. Most significantly, the research team observed that pattern formations continued during periods when human access to tide pool areas was prevented by weather conditions or seasonal closures. Arrangements discovered after severe storms or during winter months when the area was effectively inaccessible to casual visitors demonstrated that the phenomenon operated independently of human activity. Federal marine research agencies reviewed the accumulated documentation in 1989, but declined to fund expanded investigation, citing the phenomenon's localized nature and lack of apparent environmental impact. The National Marine Fisheries Service noted that Sequim Bay's marine ecosystems showed no unusual disruptions or changes that might indicate significant ecological effects from the pattern formations. However, informal monitoring continued through local research institutions and interested residents who had observed the phenomenon over several years. Documentation accumulated through 1990 and into 1991 showed that pattern formations maintained consistent characteristics, geometric precision, incorporation of materials from multiple tidal zones, and monthly occurrence during extreme low tides. The final documented pattern formation occurred on March 28, 1991. Commercial fisherman Frank Morrison, David Morrison's younger brother, discovered an elaborate spiral arrangement, incorporating over 200 individual shells, sea glass fragments, and pieces of driftwood arranged in perfect mathematical proportion across a tide pool area of approximately 12 square yards. Morrison's photographs of the March formation showed the most complex geometric design documented during the 6-year period. With multiple spiral arms extending from a central hub and incorporating materials that marine biologists calculated would require several hours to arrange manually, even with detailed planning and specialized knowledge of tide pool topography. No subsequent pattern formations were reported after March 1991, despite continued monitoring by researchers and local residents familiar with the phenomenon. Monthly surveys of Sequim Bay tide pools revealed normal distributions of shells, sea glass, and debris, consistent with typical tidal deposition patterns. The cessation of pattern formations coincided with no apparent changes in environmental conditions, human activity, or marine ecosystem dynamics that might explain why the phenomenon ended as abruptly as it had begun. Today, Sequim Bay continues to function as a popular destination for marine biology education, recreational fishing, and tide pool exploration. The extensive intertidal areas support thriving ecosystems with no unusual characteristics or behaviors that would distinguish them from other Pacific Northwest coastal environments. Tourist information makes no reference to geometric pattern formations, and local businesses report no unusual inquiries about arranged materials in tide pools. The bay's reputation rests on its natural beauty and biological diversity rather than unexplained phenomena that once attracted researchers from across the region. Yet, in university archives and private photograph collections, documentation persists of 6 years, when Sequim Bay's tide pools occasionally revealed arrangements too precise for chance and too complex for any known natural process, formed by collectors whose methods remain as mysterious as their purpose. Sometimes the most revealing information is found in the spaces where records should exist but don't. Goldendale Observatory State Park sits atop a basalt plateau in south-central Washington, 2,300 feet above sea level, with commanding views across the Columbia River Gorge to Mount Hood. Established in 1973 as the first public astronomical observatory in the Pacific Northwest, the facility was built around a 24.5-inch Cassegrain reflecting telescope donated by amateur astronomer John Marshall, who had spent over a decade grinding and polishing the primary mirror by hand. The observatory's location was carefully chosen for its exceptional viewing conditions: minimal light pollution from urban areas, low atmospheric moisture due to the region's rain shadow effect, and high elevation that reduced atmospheric distortion. Clear skies were recorded on over 200 nights annually, making Goldendale one of the premier astronomical viewing sites in the continental United States. The facility operated under the Washington State Park System with a small staff of professional astronomers and trained volunteers who conducted public viewing sessions, educational programs, and research observations. Daily operation logs documented telescope usage, atmospheric conditions, and significant astronomical events observed through the facility's sophisticated equipment. This systematic record-keeping made the gap that appeared in observation logs during the mid-1970s particularly conspicuous to researchers who later reviewed the facility's documentation. Dr. Margaret Chen, chief astronomer at Goldendale Observatory, maintained meticulous observation logs from the facility's opening in August 1973 through her final entry on September 28, 1974. Chen's records documented nightly observations, equipment performance, atmospheric conditions, and detailed notes on celestial objects studied through the observatory's primary telescope. Chen's logs showed normal operations through late September 1974, including routine observations of planets, star clusters, and nebulae that comprised the observatory's standard research and education programs. Weather conditions were excellent during the early autumn period, with clear skies permitting observations on 26 nights in September alone. On October 1, 1974, the observation log contained a single entry: observation suspended, administrative directive. No explanation accompanied the notation, nor did Chen's logs indicate the source or nature of the administrative directive that had suspended telescope operations. The same notation appeared daily through March 15, 1975, 166 consecutive days, when the observatory's primary telescope remained idle, despite optimal viewing conditions and public interest in astronomical programs. Dr. Robert Hayes, who assumed the position of chief astronomer in April 1975, found the observatory fully operational when he began his tenure. The telescope showed no signs of damage, misalignment, or technical problems that would require extended maintenance periods. All support systems, tracking drives, electronic controls, and optical components functioned within normal parameters. Hayes was told by Washington State Parks administrators that the telescope had undergone comprehensive calibration procedures during the suspension period, but no documentation existed to support this explanation. Maintenance contractor invoices showed only routine cleaning and minor adjustments that would typically require days rather than months to complete. More troubling was Hayes's discovery that the observatory's secondary equipment guide telescopes, cameras, and measurement instruments had also been unused during the suspension period, despite being unaffected by any calibration work on the primary telescope. Local amateur astronomers who had regularly attended public viewing sessions at Goldendale Observatory reported that the facility had remained completely closed to visitors during the winter months of 1974 through 1975. No advance notice was provided for the closure, and inquiries to state parks offices produced only vague references to equipment maintenance without specific schedules for resuming operations. James Morrison, who had served as volunteer coordinator for public programs, attempted to contact Dr. Chen in November 1974 to inquire about the observatory closure. Morrison discovered that Chen had transferred to a position with the University of California system, but her forwarding contact information was not provided by Washington State Parks personnel. Morrison's attempts to reach Chen through professional astronomical organizations proved unsuccessful. The American Astronomical Society had no current address information for Chen, and colleagues at other observatories reported that she had not attended professional meetings or published research since leaving Goldendale Observatory. Most disturbing was Morrison's discovery that Chen's personnel file had been transferred to restricted access status, preventing routine inquiries about her employment history or the circumstances surrounding her departure from Goldendale Observatory. Dr. William McLeod, Director of Astronomical Programs for Washington State Parks, reviewed the Goldendale Observatory situation in spring 1975, when public inquiries about the facility's closure continued after operations resumed. McLeod's investigation revealed no evidence of equipment problems, safety concerns, or budget constraints that would explain the 6-month suspension of observations. McLeod noted that the observatory's closure occurred during an optimal viewing season, when atmospheric conditions and celestial events would normally attract maximum public interest and research activity. The timing of the suspension eliminated observations of several significant astronomical phenomena, including a close approach of Comet West and favorable viewing conditions for several planetary conjunctions. Federal funding records showed no interruptions in grants supporting Goldendale Observatory operations during the relevant period. State budget allocations continued without reduction, and equipment insurance coverage remained in effect throughout the suspension period. More significantly, McLeod discovered that electricity usage at the observatory facility dropped to minimal levels during the closure period, consistent with basic security lighting, but incompatible with the extensive equipment calibration that had been cited to explain the suspension. The National Science Foundation, which provided partial funding for Goldendale Observatory research programs, requested detailed reports on the facility's activities and scientific productivity for the 1974 through 1975 period. Washington State Parks responded with documentation showing normal operations except for the unexplained 6-month gap. NSF program managers noted that the suspension period corresponded to optimal conditions for several research projects that had been approved for Goldendale Observatory, including studies of variable stars and deep space object photography that required extended observation periods during winter months when nights were longest. The loss of data from these approved research programs represented significant setbacks for scientific projects that depended on consistent long-term observations. No alternative arrangements were made to conduct the research at other facilities, and several studies were permanently discontinued due to missing data from the Goldendale Observatory suspension. Professional astronomical journals reviewed publication submissions from Goldendale Observatory and found a complete absence of research papers based on observations conducted between October 1974 and March 1975. This gap was unusual for a facility that had been producing regular scientific publications since its opening. Dr. Elizabeth Santos, who conducted a comprehensive review of Pacific Northwest astronomical facilities in 1978, attempted to interview staff members who had worked at Goldendale Observatory during the suspension period. Santos discovered that most personnel associated with the facility during 1974 had transferred to positions outside the region or left astronomical work entirely. Support staff members who remained at the observatory declined to discuss the suspension period, citing administrative policies that prohibited discussion of personnel matters or operational decisions. Several indicated that they had signed confidentiality agreements as a condition of continued employment, but no explanation was provided for why such agreements were necessary for routine astronomical facility operations. Equipment manufacturers contacted by Santos confirmed that no major calibration work had been performed on Goldendale Observatory's telescope during the suspension period. Service records showed only standard maintenance contracts that would not require extended facility closure or interruption of normal operations. The University of Washington's Astronomy Department, which maintained informal collaboration with Goldendale Observatory, reported no communication from the facility during the suspension period, despite ongoing joint research projects that required regular data exchange and coordination between institutions. Graduate students, who had been conducting thesis research using Goldendale Observatory data, were forced to modify their projects when observations ceased without explanation in October 1974. Several dissertations were delayed or fundamentally altered due to the absence of expected observational data. In 1981, the Freedom of Information Act was used to request copies of all administrative directives related to Goldendale Observatory operations during 1974 and 1975. Washington State Parks responded that no documents matching the request could be located in accessible files. Federal agencies with oversight responsibilities for publicly funded astronomical facilities reported no records of administrative directives that would require suspension of operations at Goldendale Observatory. The Department of Defense, National Science Foundation, and NASA all confirmed that no security concerns or classification issues had been raised regarding the facility's activities. Professional astronomical organizations reviewed their records for any security advisories, equipment recalls, or safety concerns that might explain the Goldendale Observatory suspension. No such issues were identified for the relevant time period, and similar facilities throughout the region continued normal operations without interruption. Today, Goldendale Observatory State Park operates as one of Washington's premier astronomical education facilities, offering public viewing programs, educational workshops, and research opportunities for amateur and professional astronomers. The 24.5-inch telescope continues to provide exceptional views of celestial objects, and the facility's remote location maintains the dark sky conditions that make it valuable for astronomical observation. Modern computerized logging systems document every observation session, equipment usage, and maintenance activity with digital precision. Visitors can review online databases showing current and historical observation records, weather conditions, and scheduled activities extending back to the facility's digital conversion in the 1990s. Yet in climate-controlled archives, a gap remains in the handwritten observation logs from the observatory's early years, 166 consecutive entries, reading "Observation Suspended," "Administrative Directive," followed by the "Resumption of Normal Operations," as if nothing had interrupted the facility's mission to explore the night sky. The telescope that had been built to reveal distant secrets maintained its own mystery, maintaining perfect silence. About 6 months when the stars continued their ancient dance above an observatory that officially was not watching. Some lakes keep their deepest secrets hidden beneath layers of official measurements and classified documentation. Lake Crescent lies in the heart of Olympic National Park, a pristine glacial lake carved during the last ice age, when massive ice sheets scoured the Olympic Peninsula into its current dramatic topography. The lake stretches 12 miles through a narrow valley surrounded by peaks that rise over 4,000 feet above its surface, creating one of the most spectacular alpine lake environments in the Pacific Northwest. Indigenous Klallam peoples called the lake Southerb, meaning taking waters, and maintain detailed oral traditions describing its unusual characteristics and seasonal behaviors. Early European explorers noted the lake's remarkable clarity, visibility often exceeding 90 feet, and its distinctive blue-green coloration that changes with weather conditions and time of day. The lake became part of Olympic National Park in 1938, preserving its watershed from logging and development that had affected other lakes in the region. Scientific interest in Lake Crescent intensified during the mid-20th century as researchers began comprehensive studies of glacial lake systems throughout the Olympic Mountains, seeking to understand their formation, ecology, and long-term environmental patterns. Standard bathymetric surveys conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey between 1958 and 1967 established Lake Crescent's official maximum depth at 624 feet, making it one of the deepest lakes in Washington state. These measurements became the authoritative reference used in all scientific publications, park management documents, and educational materials about the lake's characteristics. The precision of these official depth measurements made the dramatically different findings that emerged from a 1981 military survey particularly disturbing for researchers familiar with the lake's documented characteristics. Captain Robert Hayes of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was conducting routine hydrographic surveys of Pacific Northwest water bodies in support of regional flood control and water management planning when his team arrived at Lake Crescent on June 14, 1981. Hayes's survey utilized sophisticated sonar equipment designed for deep-water navigation and military applications, providing depth resolution capabilities far exceeding the instruments used in previous civilian surveys. The military-grade sonar could detect bottom contours, underwater obstacles, and depth variations with precision measured in inches rather than feet. Initial sonar readings as Hayes's survey boat crossed the lake's center produced results that contradicted all existing depth measurements. The sonar indicated a maximum depth of 937 feet, over 300 feet deeper than any previously recorded measurement. Hayes immediately ordered equipment calibration checks, assuming instrument malfunction or operator error. However, repeated measurements using backup sonar systems and different operational parameters consistently produced similar results, confirming depths that exceeded official measurements by substantial margins. More troubling was the discovery that the deepest readings occurred in areas where civilian surveys had recorded relatively shallow water. According to official bathymetric charts, Hayes's survey boat was crossing sections of lake bottom that should have been less than 400 feet deep, not approaching depths of nearly 1,000 feet. Hayes's preliminary report, filed with Army Corps headquarters in Seattle on June 22, 1981, documented the depth discrepancies and requested authorization to conduct extended survey operations to resolve the apparent measurement errors. Dr. Margaret Chen, a limnologist from the University of Washington who had studied Lake Crescent for over a decade, learned of the military survey results through informal professional channels and contacted Hayes to request access to the detailed sonar data. Chen's research had relied on the established depth measurements for studies of lake thermal stratification, aquatic habitat distribution, and sediment deposition patterns. If the lake was significantly deeper than documented, her conclusions about its ecological characteristics would require fundamental revision. Hayes initially agreed to share technical data with Chen's research team, recognizing that civilian scientists possessed expertise in lake systems that could help explain the measurement discrepancies. However, before any data transfer could occur, Hayes received orders from Corps headquarters classifying all survey results and terminating civilian collaboration. Chen's subsequent written requests for sonar data were denied by Army Corps administrators who cited geological security concerns as justification for restricting access to information about Lake Crescent's depth measurements. No explanation was provided for why lake depth data would constitute a security issue or what geological factors might require classification. Park Service officials at Olympic National Park expressed confusion about the classification of Lake Crescent survey data, noting that the lake's location within a national park made it subject to extensive public access and recreational use that would seem incompatible with security restrictions. Superintendent William Morrison requested clarification from the Army Corps regarding the nature of geological security concerns that would affect park management and visitor safety planning. Morrison noted that accurate depth measurements were essential for search and rescue operations, boating safety programs, and environmental monitoring that comprised routine park responsibilities. The Army Corps responded to Morrison's inquiries with a brief memorandum stating that detailed bathymetric data for Lake Crescent had been determined to contain information relevant to national defense and would remain classified indefinitely. No additional details were provided about the specific security implications of lake depth measurements. Professional diving instructor Frank Santos, who had conducted underwater operations in Lake Crescent for over 15 years, reported observations that appeared to support the military survey's findings of greater depths than officially documented. Santos noted that during deep diving operations for research and recovery purposes, he had encountered bottom contours and underwater terrain features that seemed inconsistent with published bathymetric charts. Compass readings and depth gauge measurements suggested that certain areas of the lake extended significantly deeper than mapped depths indicated. More disturbing was Santos's observation that standard diving tables and decompression calculations based on official lake depths had proven inadequate for some operations, suggesting that actual diving depths exceeded those predicted by published measurements. Santos reported these discrepancies to park officials and offered to conduct systematic underwater surveys using civilian diving equipment to verify lake depths independently. Park administrators declined the offer, citing safety concerns and existing research protocols that relied on official measurement data. The National Science Foundation, which funded ongoing ecological research at Lake Crescent, requested clarification from the Army Corps regarding the availability of updated bathymetric data for scientific purposes. NSF officials noted that accurate depth measurements were fundamental to numerous research projects, studying lake ecology, climate history, and environmental change. The Army Corps response to NSF indicated that no updated bathymetric data would be released for civilian research purposes, and that all future surveys of Lake Crescent would require military approval and security clearance procedures. Research proposals involving depth measurements or underwater investigations would be subject to classification review. This unprecedented restriction on scientific access to basic geographic data about a national park lake created significant obstacles for researchers who had been conducting long-term studies of Lake Crescent's ecosystem and environmental characteristics. Dr. Elizabeth McLeod, who had been studying sediment cores from Lake Crescent to reconstruct regional climate history, found her research fundamentally compromised by the inability to correlate sediment layers with accurate water depth measurements. McLeod's work depended on precise understanding of how sediment deposition patterns varied with water depth and bottom topography. Without reliable bathymetric data, she could not determine whether sediment samples represented deep water or shallow water conditions, making interpretation of climate indicators impossible. Graduate students conducting thesis research on Lake Crescent ecology were forced to modify their projects or relocate to other study sites where depth measurements remained available for scientific use. Several promising research programs were discontinued due to the classification of fundamental geographic data. Professional oceanographic equipment manufacturers contacted by concerned researchers confirmed that modern sonar systems routinely achieved depth measurement accuracy within inches, making the substantial discrepancies between civilian and military surveys difficult to explain through instrumental error. Equipment specialists noted that the type of military sonar used in the 1981 Army Corps survey was specifically designed for deep water applications and would be expected to provide more accurate measurements than the older equipment used in previous civilian surveys. The possibility that Lake Crescent was significantly deeper than documented raised questions about its geological formation, ecological characteristics, and potential hazards that would affect park management and public safety planning. In 1985, the Freedom of Information Act was used to request declassification of the Army Corps survey data from Lake Crescent. The request was denied on grounds of national security, with no indication of when or whether the information might become available for scientific or public access. Similar requests filed through academic institutions and professional organizations produced identical responses, suggesting a systematic policy of maintaining classification for all detailed bathymetric data from the 1981 military survey. Today, Lake Crescent remains one of Olympic National Park's most popular destinations, attracting thousands of visitors annually for boating, fishing, and scenic appreciation. Park literature continues to reference the official maximum depth of 624 feet, and recreational activities are planned according to safety guidelines based on these established measurements. Modern GPS-guided depth finders used by recreational boaters occasionally register readings that exceed official depth measurements, but these discrepancies are generally attributed to equipment variations or operator error rather than fundamental inaccuracies in published lake data. Yet somewhere in classified military archives, detailed sonar data documents a lake crescent that extends nearly 1,000 feet into the Olympic Peninsula bedrock depths that would place its bottom far below sea level and raise questions about the geological processes that carved such an extraordinary depression in the mountain landscape. The lake continues to reflect the surrounding peaks with the same pristine clarity that has attracted visitors for generations. Its surface revealing nothing about the possibility that its deepest waters remain unmeasured by any instrument whose findings are available to the scientists and public who depend on knowing where the bottom actually lies. Nature follows precise laws, but sometimes those laws produce patterns too perfect for coincidence and too temporary for science to study. Mount Baker rises 10,781 feet above the North Cascade Range, a dormant stratovolcano whose glaciated peaks dominate the skyline of northwestern Washington. The mountain anchors the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, encompassing over 170,000 acres of old-growth temperate rainforest that has remained largely undisturbed since the last ice age. The region's isolation and challenging terrain limited human access until the mid-20th century, when improved roads and aerial survey capabilities allowed systematic documentation of the area's ecological characteristics. Dense forest coverage, steep topography, and frequent cloud cover had prevented detailed mapping of remote sections surrounding the mountain, leaving vast areas that existed only as blank spaces on forestry charts. Indigenous Nooksack peoples maintained traditional hunting and gathering routes through the Mount Baker region for thousands of years, but their oral traditions contained few references to the specific area that would later attract scientific attention. The forest section in question lay at approximately 4,000 feet elevation on the mountain's northwestern slope, accessible only by foot through unmarked terrain that required expert navigation skills. This remoteness made the discovery documented in U.S. Forest Service aerial photography particularly significant for researchers attempting to understand Pacific Northwest forest ecology. Pilot James Morrison was conducting routine aerial surveys for the Forest Service on August 23, 1958, when he photographed what appeared to be an extraordinary natural phenomenon, approximately 12 miles northwest of Mount Baker's summit. Morrison's cameras, mounted on a Piper Super Cub aircraft equipped for high-resolution forest inventory work, captured images of approximately 30 acres where mature Douglas fir and western hemlock trees appeared to be growing in perfect mathematical spirals. The photographs showed 3 distinct spiral formations, each covering roughly 10 acres, with tree positions creating geometric patterns that resembled enormous nautilus shells when viewed from above. The spiral formations were clearly visible in Morrison's photographs due to subtle variations in tree height and canopy density that created light and shadow patterns, emphasizing the geometric arrangements. Individual trees within the spirals appeared to be mature specimens, suggesting that the patterns had developed over decades or centuries, rather than representing recent plantings or human intervention. Morrison's initial assumption was that the photographs documented unusual but natural forest growth patterns, possibly related to soil conditions, water drainage, or other environmental factors that might influence tree distribution over time. However, when Morrison's photographs were reviewed by Forest Service botanists, the mathematical precision of the tree arrangements raised questions that standard forest ecology could not easily answer. Dr. Margaret Chen, a forest ecologist from the University of Washington, was contracted by the Forest Service to investigate the spiral formations after Morrison's photographs attracted attention from researchers studying natural pattern formation in biological systems. Chen assembled a field research team that included botanists, soil specialists, and survey experts equipped to conduct comprehensive analysis of the area documented in Morrison's aerial photographs. The team's mission was to document the tree formations, study their ecological characteristics, and determine the natural processes responsible for creating such precisely geometric patterns. Chen's team departed for the Mount Baker area on June 15, 1959, carrying GPS equipment, soil sampling tools, and surveying instruments designed to map tree positions with scientific accuracy. After 3 days of hiking through unmarked terrain, Chen's team reached the coordinates where Morrison's photographs indicated the spiral tree formations should be located. They found typical old-growth forest with no evidence of geometric patterns. Chen's initial assumption was that navigation errors had led the team to the wrong location. However, repeated GPS readings confirmed their position, matched the coordinates derived from Morrison's aerial photographs. Topographical features visible in the photographs, rocky outcroppings, stream courses, and distinctive clearings matched the terrain exactly. The trees themselves appeared to be mature, old-growth specimens, consistent with the forest canopy shown in Morrison's images. Tree ring analysis of core samples indicated ages ranging from 200 to over 400 years, confirming that the forest had been established long before any human presence in the region. However, careful surveying revealed completely random tree distribution, with no geometric patterns, mathematical relationships, or spiral arrangements of any kind. Chen's team conducted systematic mapping of tree positions across the entire 30-acre area documented in Morrison's photographs. Computer analysis of their survey data revealed tree distribution patterns consistent with natural forest growth, showing the random spacing and irregular clusters typical of old-growth ecosystems. Most disturbing was Chen's discovery that the individual trees visible in Morrison's photographs could be identified and matched with specific specimens found during the ground survey. Tree species, relative sizes, and distinctive characteristics allowed positive identification of numerous individual trees shown in both the aerial photographs and ground observations. The trees were the same, but their positions were completely different. Dr. Robert Hayes, a mathematician from Western Washington University, reviewed Morrison's photographs and Chen's survey data to analyze the discrepancy between aerial and ground observations. Hayes confirmed that the spiral patterns visible in the aerial photographs displayed mathematical properties consistent with logarithmic spirals found throughout nature, similar to nautilus shells, galaxy formations, and other biological and physical systems that follow precise geometric principles. The spacing between trees within the spirals corresponded to mathematical ratios that Hayes calculated as variations of the golden ratio, suggesting natural processes operating according to fundamental mathematical laws rather than random distribution patterns. However, Hayes also confirmed that Chen's ground survey data showed no trace of these mathematical relationships. Tree positions measured during the field investigation displayed statistical randomness typical of natural forest growth, with no correlations, patterns, or geometric arrangements detectable through analysis. Professional aerial photographer William Santos, who had extensive experience documenting Pacific Northwest forests, examined Morrison's photographs to assess potential explanations for the apparent tree formation patterns. Santos noted that the spiral arrangements were clearly visible in the original negatives and could not be attributed to photographic artifacts, optical illusions, or processing errors. The patterns appeared as genuine variations in forest canopy structure that would require actual differences in tree positions to create the observed light and shadow effects. Santos conducted comparison flights over the same area in 1960 and 1961, using identical camera equipment and flying at similar altitudes and angles as Morrison's original survey. His photographs showed normal, random forest growth, with no geometric patterns or spiral formations. Weather records confirmed that atmospheric conditions during Morrison's flight were ideal for aerial photography, with clear skies and minimal wind that would eliminate optical distortion or atmospheric effects that might create false pattern appearances. The U.S. Forest Service commissioned independent analysis of Morrison's photographs by the National Institute of Standards and Technology to determine whether unknown technical factors might explain the apparent discrepancy between aerial and force-to-do ground observations. NIST specialists confirmed that Morrison's photographs were technically sound and showed no evidence of manipulation, double exposure, or other factors that might create false pattern appearances. The spiral formations documented in the images represented genuine variations in forest structure that would require actual differences in tree positions. Photogrammetric analysis allowed NIST researchers to calculate precise three-dimensional positions for individual trees based on their appearance in Morrison's aerial photographs. These calculated positions matched the spiral patterns visible in the images and confirmed the mathematical relationships identified by Hayes. However, when the calculated tree positions were compared with Chen's ground survey data, they showed no correlation. Trees that appeared to be positioned according to spiral geometry in the aerial photographs were found in completely different locations during ground investigation. The Forest Service classified Morrison's photographs and related research data as anomalous findings, requiring additional investigation before public release. However, no funding was allocated for follow-up studies, and the investigation was administratively closed in 1962. Attempts by university researchers to obtain copies of Morrison's photographs for additional analysis were denied, with Forest Service administrators citing ongoing research and potential copyright issues as reasons for restricting access to the images. Dr. Elizabeth MacLeod, who conducted a comprehensive review of Pacific Northwest forest ecology in 1975, discovered references to the Mount Baker spiral formations in internal Forest Service documents, but could not obtain the original photographs or research data for inclusion in her study. MacLeod noted that the described phenomenon would represent a significant discovery in forest ecology if verified, potentially revealing unknown natural processes that influence tree distribution over long time periods. However, the classification of research materials prevented scientific evaluation of the claims. Professional forestry organizations reviewed the available documentation and expressed interest in conducting independent verification studies, but were unable to obtain specific location information or photographic evidence necessary to design appropriate research protocols. The area where Morrison's photographs documented spiral tree formations was designated as a research reserve in 1978, with access restricted to authorized scientific personnel. However, no research activities were conducted in the reserve, and the restriction appeared to serve primarily as a means of preventing unauthorized investigation. Today, the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest encompasses the same old-growth ecosystems that attracted Morrison's aerial survey work in the 1950s. Modern satellite imagery and GPS technology provide detailed documentation of forest characteristics, with resolution far exceeding the capabilities available to earlier researchers. Digital forest inventory systems track individual tree locations, species composition, and growth patterns with electronic precision. Aerial surveys conduct comprehensive mapping of forest resources using multispectral sensors and computer analysis that would immediately detect any geometric patterns or unusual formations. Yet somewhere in restricted archives, aerial photographs document 30 acres of perfect mathematical spirals formed by trees that ground surveys proved were never arranged in any pattern at all, leaving researchers to wonder whether nature occasionally organizes itself according to principles that exist only long enough to be photographed, but too briefly to be studied. Some weather patterns follow schedules that meteorology cannot explain and instruments cannot measure. Vashon Island sits in the southern reaches of Puget Sound, a rural community of approximately 10,000 residents connected to the mainland only by ferry service from Tacoma and West Seattle. The island stretches 13 miles north to south, with rolling hills, dense forests, and farmland that has supported agricultural communities since the late 19th century. The island's maritime climate creates weather patterns typical of the Pacific Northwest: mild temperatures, frequent precipitation, and seasonal fog that forms when moist air from the Pacific encounters the cooler waters of Puget Sound. Normal fog conditions vary with atmospheric pressure, wind patterns, and temperature differentials that follow predictable meteorological principles. Indigenous peoples of the Puyallup and Muckleshoot tribes had used Vashon Island for seasonal hunting and gathering for thousands of years before European settlement, maintaining detailed knowledge of local weather patterns and seasonal changes. Their oral traditions included references to unusual fog formations along the island's western shore, though early ethnographers dismissed these accounts as metaphorical descriptions of typical marine weather. The island's isolation and stable rural population made it an ideal location for weather monitoring stations established during the 1960s as part of regional atmospheric research programs studying Pacific Northwest climate patterns. This systematic weather documentation made the phenomenon that began in March 1972 particularly notable for meteorologists familiar with Puget Sound atmospheric conditions. David Morrison, who operated a small weather monitoring station at his farm on Vashon Island's western shore, first documented the unusual fog formation on March 18, 1972. Morrison had maintained detailed weather records for over 8 years as part of a volunteer program supporting National Weather Service data collection. Morrison's observations indicated that a dense fog bank, approximately half a mile wide, had formed along a specific section of the island's western coastline at sunrise, covering roughly 2 miles of shoreline from Cove to Burton. The fog extended inland for approximately 1/4 mile before ending in a clearly defined boundary that remained stationary throughout the morning hours. Weather conditions on March 18th were clear, with high-pressure systems that would normally prevent fog formation. Temperature and humidity readings showed no atmospheric characteristics that would support condensation or fog development according to standard meteorological models. More disturbing was Morrison's observation that the fog appeared to maintain consistent density and boundaries despite wind conditions that should have dispersed or moved the formation. Gentle onshore breezes registered on his weather instruments, but the fog bank remained stationary and intact until disappearing abruptly at sunset. Morrison initially attributed the phenomenon to unusual local topography or microclimate conditions that might create fog formation under circumstances not predicted by standard weather models. However, when the identical fog formation appeared the following morning at sunrise and persisted for exactly 12 hours before dissipating, Morrison began systematic documentation of what would prove to be a persistent atmospheric anomaly. Over the following 6 months, Morrison recorded the appearance of the fog bank every morning without exception, regardless of weather conditions, atmospheric pressure, or seasonal changes. The formation maintained identical characteristics: half-mile width, 2-mile length, precise boundaries, and 12-hour duration from sunrise to sunset. Dr. Margaret Chen, a meteorologist from the University of Washington, visited Morrison's weather station in September 1972 to investigate reports of the unusual fog formation. Chen brought professional atmospheric monitoring equipment designed to measure temperature gradients, humidity levels, and air pressure variations that might explain fog development under apparently unsuitable conditions. Chen's measurements confirmed Morrison's observations, while revealing additional disturbing characteristics of the phenomenon. The fog bank exhibited uniform density throughout its extent, with no variations in thickness or moisture content that would be expected in natural fog formations. Temperature readings within the fog showed no significant differences from surrounding air temperatures, contradicting the thermal conditions necessary for fog formation and persistence. Humidity levels inside the fog bank were actually lower than in surrounding clear air, suggesting that the visible moisture was not behaving according to normal atmospheric physics. Most significantly, Chen discovered that wind measurements showed air movement completely ceasing within the fog bank, despite continuous airflow in adjacent areas. The fog appeared to exist within a zone of completely still air that extended vertically to approximately 200 feet above ground level. Local residents who lived within the area covered by the fog formation provided additional perspectives that complicated meteorological analysis. Martha Peterson, whose farmhouse was located at the southern edge of the fog zone, reported that visibility within the fog remained consistent at approximately 50 feet, regardless of density variations that would normally affect visibility in natural fog. Peterson noted that the fog produced no dampness or moisture effects that would typically accompany dense fog conditions. Clothing, vehicles, and outdoor equipment showed no condensation accumulation despite being surrounded by apparently heavy fog for 12 hours daily. More disturbing was Peterson's observation that wildlife behavior remained normal within the fog zone. Birds continued normal feeding and nesting activities, and livestock showed no signs of the disorientation or stress typically associated with dense fog conditions. Commercial fisherman Frank Santos, who operated from a small marina within the fog zone, reported that navigation remained surprisingly easy despite apparently dense fog conditions. Familiar landmarks remained visible at distances that should have been completely obscured by fog of the observed density. Santos noted that fishing conditions within the fog zone were consistently excellent, with fish populations appearing unaffected by the daily fog cycle. Water temperature and tidal patterns showed no unusual characteristics that might correlate with the fog formation. Most significantly, Santos observed that boats entering the fog zone from clear water experienced no transition period or gradual visibility reduction. The fog boundary was so precisely defined that vessels could simultaneously have their bow in clear air and stern in fog, with a sharply delineated line of visibility running through the middle of the boat. The National Weather Service assigned atmospheric physicist Dr. Robert Hayes to investigate the Vashon Island fog phenomenon during spring 1973. Hayes established comprehensive monitoring stations throughout the affected area, using sophisticated equipment designed to detect atmospheric conditions that might explain fog formation under seemingly impossible circumstances. Hayes's investigation confirmed all previous observations, while documenting additional anomalies that challenged fundamental principles of atmospheric physics. The fog formation occurred with mechanical precision, appearing within minutes of sunrise and dissipating with equal speed at sunset, regardless of cloud cover or solar visibility. Satellite imagery showed the fog formation as a clearly defined rectangular area of low visibility, but infrared sensors detected no temperature variations or thermal signatures that would indicate the presence of water vapor or atmospheric moisture. Aircraft reconnaissance flights conducted by Hayes revealed that the fog formation extended to a precise altitude of 200 feet above ground level, creating a flat-topped layer with geometrically perfect boundaries. No atmospheric conditions existed at higher altitudes that would explain the formation or maintenance of the fog layer. Most troubling was Hayes's discovery that weather prediction models could not account for the fog formation using any combination of atmospheric variables. Computer simulations, based on local weather data, consistently predicted clear conditions during times when the fog was clearly visible and documented. The Federal Aviation Administration became involved in the investigation when pilots reported navigation difficulties related to the Vashon Island fog formation. The precisely defined boundaries and predictable timing created a unique aviation hazard that required special procedures for aircraft operating in the Puget Sound area. FAA investigators confirmed that the fog formation appeared on radar screens as a discrete weather system, but air traffic control radar detected no precipitation, wind patterns, or atmospheric disturbances that would normally accompany fog formation of such density and persistence. Airport weather stations throughout the region showed no correlation between the Vashon Island fog and atmospheric conditions at other locations, suggesting that the phenomenon operated independently of regional weather patterns. The University of Washington's Atmospheric Sciences Department established a permanent research station on Vashon Island in 1975 to conduct long-term study of the fog formation. Graduate students and faculty researchers documented the phenomenon continuously for 2 years, accumulating comprehensive data on its characteristics and behavior. Research findings confirmed the fog's mechanical precision and complete independence from normal meteorological factors. The formation appeared and dissipated according to solar timing with accuracy measured in minutes, regardless of cloud cover, atmospheric pressure, or seasonal weather patterns. Chemical analysis of air samples taken within the fog revealed normal atmospheric composition with no unusual gases, particles, or other substances that might explain the visible appearance of fog without corresponding moisture content. Most significantly, researchers discovered that photography and video recording equipment produced normal images when operated within the fog zone, showing clear visibility despite human observers reporting dense fog conditions. Cameras appeared to see through the fog that was clearly visible to human eyes. In December 1978, the Vashon Island fog formation began showing signs of degradation. The precisely defined boundaries became less distinct, and the 12-hour duration became irregular, sometimes persisting for only 8 or 9 hours before dissipating. By March 1979, the fog formation had completely ceased. Weather monitoring equipment continued normal operations, but no trace remained of the atmospheric anomaly that had persisted for over 7 years with mechanical precision. No explanation was provided for the disappearance of the fog formation. Atmospheric conditions on Vashon Island returned to typical Pacific Northwest patterns, with normal fog occurring occasionally under appropriate meteorological circumstances. Today, Vashon Island experiences weather patterns consistent with its maritime location in Puget Sound. Morning fog forms occasionally during autumn and winter months, when temperature and humidity conditions create appropriate atmospheric circumstances for natural fog development. The island's western shore shows no unusual atmospheric characteristics, and weather monitoring stations document normal variations in temperature, humidity, and wind patterns typical of coastal Pacific Northwest locations. Yet, in university archives and National Weather Service records, 7 years of documentation describe a fog formation that appeared daily with the precision of a scheduled event, covering the same area for exactly 12 hours, regardless of weather conditions that made its existence impossible, according to every principle of atmospheric science. Sometimes the most sophisticated instruments detect patterns that their operators were never meant to understand. The Hanford Nuclear Reservation sprawls across 586 square miles of south-central Washington's Columbia River Plateau, a restricted area that once produced plutonium for the United States nuclear weapons program. Established in 1943 as part of the Manhattan Project, the facility operated 9 nuclear reactors and numerous chemical processing plants until the end of the Cold War, leaving behind one of the most contaminated sites in the Western Hemisphere. The reservation's location was chosen for its isolation from population centers, abundant water supply from the Columbia River, and geological stability that would support massive industrial operations. Security restrictions limited access to authorized personnel, creating a closed environment where thousands of workers conducted classified nuclear operations for nearly 5 decades. By the 1980s, Hanford's mission had shifted from weapons production to environmental cleanup and waste management, requiring comprehensive monitoring systems to track radiation levels throughout the vast reservation. Hundreds of detection stations measured alpha, beta, and gamma radiation continuously, creating detailed records of contamination patterns and environmental conditions. This extensive monitoring network made the anomalous readings that began appearing in 1983 particularly significant for technicians responsible for maintaining accurate radiation surveillance across the facility. Senior radiation protection technician David Morrison first noticed the unusual measurement pattern on September 14, 1983, while reviewing daily monitoring reports from Station Alpha 7, located approximately 2 miles east of the former B reactor complex. The station's readings showed a gradual increase in background gamma radiation over a 72-hour period, with measurements rising in precise increments of 0.05 milliroentgens per hour every 12 hours. The progression began at normal background levels of 0.12 milliroentgens per hour and increased to 0.37 milliroentgens per hour before returning abruptly to baseline readings. Morrison initially assumed the readings indicated equipment malfunction or calibration drift, common problems with sensitive radiation detection instruments exposed to harsh environmental conditions. However, when he examined the measurement sequence more carefully, he discovered that the increases followed a perfect mathematical progression, with no random variation or measurement uncertainty. Standard radiation measurements typically show minor fluctuations due to natural background variations, instrument noise, and environmental factors such as atmospheric pressure changes. The Station Alpha 7 readings displayed none of these normal variations, suggesting either extremely precise radiation sources or systematic instrument error. Morrison documented the incident and scheduled equipment maintenance for the following week, expecting to find calibration problems or component failures that would explain the unusual measurement pattern. However, before maintenance could be performed, identical measurement progressions were reported at 3 additional monitoring stations located several miles apart across the reservation. Each station recorded the same mathematical sequence increases of 0.05 milliroentgens per hour at 12-hour intervals before returning to normal background levels. Dr. Margaret Chen, chief health physicist for Hanford Environmental Monitoring, reviewed Morrison's documentation and the additional reports from other stations. Chen had supervised radiation monitoring operations for over 8 years and possessed detailed knowledge of instrument capabilities, environmental conditions, and measurement protocols used throughout the reservation. Chen's analysis confirmed that the measurement progressions violated normal patterns of radiation detection and environmental variation. Natural radiation sources would not produce the precise mathematical relationships observed across multiple monitoring locations, and equipment malfunctions would typically affect individual instruments rather than creating identical patterns at different stations. More disturbing was Chen's discovery that the affected monitoring stations used different types of detection equipment from various manufacturers, making systematic instrument error unlikely to explain the consistent measurement progressions. Radiation Protection Supervisor Robert Hayes conducted field inspections of all stations, reporting unusual measurement patterns, seeking evidence of contamination sources, equipment problems, or environmental conditions that might explain the anomalous readings. Hayes found no evidence of radioactive material deposits, equipment damage, or unusual environmental conditions at any of the affected monitoring locations. Calibration checks using standard radiation sources confirmed that all instruments were functioning within normal specifications and producing accurate measurements. Most significantly, Hayes observed that the measurement progressions occurred during periods when no scheduled activities were taking place near the affected monitoring stations. The precise timing and mathematical relationships suggested either unknown radiation sources or previously unobserved instrument behavior. Technician Patricia Santos, who maintained monitoring equipment at Station Gamma 12, provided detailed observations of the phenomenon during a measurement progression that occurred in October 1983. Santos noted that the station's analog displays showed smooth, gradual increases in radiation levels over the 12-hour intervals, rather than sudden jumps that might indicate equipment switching or external interference. The increases appeared to be genuine radiation measurements, rather than electronic artifacts or calibration errors. More disturbing was Santos's observation that backup monitoring systems at the same location recorded identical measurement progressions, confirming that the patterns were not specific to individual instruments or detection methods. Santos reported no unusual sounds, vibrations, or other physical phenomena that might indicate nearby equipment, operation, or environmental changes during the periods when measurement progressions occurred. Quality assurance engineer William McLeod reviewed manufacturing specifications and calibration procedures for all monitoring equipment reporting unusual measurement patterns. McLeod's investigation sought to identify design characteristics or operational parameters that might cause multiple instruments to produce identical mathematical sequences under specific conditions. McLeod found no technical explanations for the observed measurement progressions. The affected instruments represented different technologies, manufacturers, and operational principles that would not be expected to exhibit identical behavior patterns under any known circumstances. Calibration records showed that all affected instruments had been serviced and tested according to standard procedures, with no evidence of systematic errors or maintenance problems that might explain the anomalous readings. The Department of Energy, which supervised Hanford operations, assigned nuclear safety specialist Dr. Elizabeth Hayes to investigate the measurement progressions and assess potential implications for facility safety and environmental monitoring. Hayes's investigation included comprehensive analysis of facility operations, environmental conditions, and monitoring system performance during periods when measurement progressions occurred. Her team reviewed classified operational records, interviewed technical personnel, and conducted independent radiation surveys to verify monitoring system accuracy. Hayes confirmed that no facility operations, waste handling activities, or environmental conditions could account for the precise mathematical progressions observed at multiple monitoring stations. The patterns appeared to represent genuine radiation measurements that followed mathematical relationships not consistent with known radioactive decay processes or environmental sources. More troubling was Hayes's discovery that the measurement progressions occurred with statistical precision that exceeded the capabilities of the monitoring instruments to detect. The observed mathematical relationships required measurement accuracy beyond the specifications of the detection equipment, suggesting either unknown radiation sources with extraordinary precision or previously unrecognized instrument capabilities. Federal radiation safety regulations required investigation of any anomalous measurements that might indicate uncontrolled radioactive material or equipment malfunctions affecting public safety. However, the mathematical nature of the Hanford progressions did not fit standard categories of radiation safety incidents or regulatory violations. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission reviewed Hayes's investigation and requested additional documentation to determine whether the measurement progressions represented safety hazards, requiring regulatory action. NRC officials noted that the precise mathematical relationships suggested either sophisticated experimental equipment or measurement phenomena outside normal regulatory oversight. Hayes provided comprehensive documentation showing that the measurement progressions posed no apparent safety risks and did not indicate uncontrolled radioactive material or facility operational problems. However, she could offer no explanation for the mathematical precision of the radiation patterns. In 1985, the measurement progressions ceased as abruptly as they had begun. Monitoring stations throughout Hanford returned to normal background readings with typical random variations expected from environmental radiation sources and instrument noise. No changes in facility operations, environmental conditions, or monitoring equipment explained the cessation of the mathematical measurement patterns. Instruments continued functioning according to specifications, but the precise progressions never recurred. Comprehensive reviews of monitoring data from the 1983 through 1985 period confirmed that the mathematical progressions had occurred at 17 different stations across the reservation, involving over 40 separate instruments from 6 different manufacturers. Statistical analysis of the measurement sequences revealed mathematical relationships with precision exceeding 1 part in 10,000 accuracy, far beyond the capabilities of the monitoring equipment or natural radiation variation patterns. Today, Hanford continues its environmental cleanup mission using modern digital monitoring systems that provide real-time radiation measurements with electronic precision and automated data logging. Hundreds of detection stations monitor contamination levels throughout the reservation, creating comprehensive records of environmental conditions and cleanup progress. The current monitoring network has documented no measurement progressions or mathematical patterns comparable to those observed during the 1980s. Background radiation levels fluctuate according to normal environmental variations, and instrument readings show the random noise characteristics expected from sensitive detection equipment. Yet, in facility archives, 3 years of monitoring records document periods when Hanford's radiation detectors measured mathematical progressions that followed rules more precise than the instruments were designed to detect, suggesting that some phenomena operate according to principles that existed at the intersection of nuclear physics and pure mathematics. Visible only to machines sensitive enough to detect radiation, but too simple to understand what they were actually measuring. Some borders exist beyond the maps that diplomats draw, marked by phenomena that navigation instruments detect but cannot explain. Point Roberts occupies a unique position in North American geography, a 5-square-mile peninsula that extends south from British Columbia into Boundary Bay, but remains United States territory due to the 49th parallel boundary established by the Oregon Treaty of 1846. This geographic anomaly creates the only land-based U.S.-Canada border crossing accessible only by traveling through Canada, making Point Roberts one of the most isolated communities in the continental United States. The peninsula's unusual status has created complications for residents, customs officials, and maritime traffic since the border was established. Approximately 1,000 residents live in this geographic enclave, dependent on Canadian infrastructure for utilities and road access, while remaining subject to U.S. federal jurisdiction and customs requirements. The surrounding waters of Boundary Bay and Georgia Strait serve as heavily traveled shipping lanes connecting Vancouver and Seattle ports, with hundreds of commercial and recreational vessels crossing the invisible maritime boundary daily. These waters also host significant fishing fleets from both nations, creating complex navigation challenges in an area where national boundaries exist only as lines on charts rather than visible maritime features. This heavy maritime traffic made the navigation anomalies that began appearing in Coast Guard logs during the early 1980s particularly significant for vessels operating in the Point Roberts area. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes, commanding Coast Guard Station Bellingham, first documented the compass deviation reports on March 22, 1982, when commercial fishing vessel Sandra Marie radioed a navigation emergency while crossing from U.S. waters into Canadian territorial waters near Point Roberts. Captain David Morrison reported that his vessel's magnetic compass had deviated 15 degrees north of its proper heading as the boat crossed the maritime boundary, causing confusion about his exact position relative to Canadian territorial limits. Morrison noted that the deviation occurred suddenly as the vessel crossed the boundary and persisted until the boat had traveled approximately 1/4 mile into Canadian waters. The Sandra Marie carried modern navigation equipment including both magnetic and gyroscopic compasses, radio direction finding gear, and GPS systems that were becoming standard for commercial fishing operations. Morrison reported that only the magnetic compass was affected by the deviation, while other navigation instruments continued to provide accurate readings. Morrison initially attributed the compass problem to equipment malfunction or local magnetic interference. But when he returned to U.S. waters later that day, the magnetic compass resumed normal operation with no apparent calibration errors or mechanical problems. Coast Guard regulations required investigation of all reported navigation hazards in international waters, particularly those affecting compass accuracy in areas with heavy maritime traffic and complex jurisdictional boundaries. Hayes assigned Petty Officer Margaret Chen to document and investigate compass deviation reports in the Point Roberts area, beginning with systematic interviews of vessels that regularly cross the maritime boundary during commercial and recreational operations. Chen's investigation revealed that magnetic compass deviation near Point Roberts had been reported by 12 different vessels during the previous 6 months. But most incidents had been attributed to equipment problems or operator error rather than environmental conditions affecting navigation. The reported deviations showed remarkable consistency, 15 degrees magnetic north, occurring only during boundary crossings, and affecting only magnetic compass systems, while leaving other navigation equipment unaffected. Professional fishing captain Frank Santos, who operated regularly in Boundary Bay waters, provided detailed observations of the compass deviation phenomenon during multiple crossings between U.S. and Canadian territorial waters. Santos noted that the deviation occurred with mechanical precision, beginning as his vessel crossed the invisible maritime boundary and ending exactly when the boat had traveled sufficient distance to be entirely within Canadian territorial waters. The transition points were so precisely defined that Santos could predict compass behavior based on his GPS position relative to the international boundary. More disturbing was Santos's observation that the deviation affected magnetic compasses regardless of their age, manufacturer, or calibration status. Both traditional marine compasses and modern electronic magnetic heading systems showed identical 15-degree deviations during boundary crossings. Santos reported no unusual weather conditions, electromagnetic interference, or other environmental factors that might explain magnetic field disturbances in the Point Roberts area. Fishing equipment, radio systems, and engine operations remained normal during periods when compass deviations occurred. Recreational boater Patricia McLeod documented her experiences with compass deviation during weekend trips between Blaine, Washington, and Vancouver, British Columbia, routes that required crossing the maritime boundary near Point Roberts multiple times. McLeod noted that the compass deviation created significant navigation challenges for recreational boaters who relied on magnetic compass readings for basic navigation in waters where GPS systems were not yet widely available for civilian use. Most significantly, McLeod observed that the deviation affected vessels crossing the boundary in both directions, from U.S. to Canadian waters and from Canadian to U.S. waters with identical timing and magnitude, regardless of the direction of travel. McLeod's detailed logs showed that compass deviation occurred during boundary crossings, conducted under various weather conditions, tide levels, and times of day, suggesting that the phenomenon was not related to atmospheric or oceanic conditions that might affect magnetic field behavior. The Canadian Coast Guard received similar reports from vessels operating in the same waters, prompting coordination between U.S. and Canadian maritime authorities to investigate potential navigation hazards affecting international shipping lanes. Joint investigations revealed that Canadian vessels experienced identical compass deviations when crossing the maritime boundary, confirming that the phenomenon affected navigation equipment, regardless of vessel nationality or registration. Both Coast Guard services conducted comprehensive surveys of magnetic field characteristics in the Point Roberts area, using specialized equipment designed to detect magnetic anomalies that might affect ship navigation systems. Magnetic surveys revealed no unusual magnetic field variations, geological formations, or underwater features that would explain compass deviations in the boundary area. Magnetic declination measurements corresponded to published navigational charts, and no local magnetic anomalies were detected during comprehensive surveys of the region. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration assigned geophysicist Dr. William Chen to investigate potential causes of magnetic compass deviation in the Point Roberts boundary waters during summer 1983. Chen's investigation included detailed analysis of geological surveys, magnetic field measurements, and oceanographic data that might explain localized magnetic anomalies affecting navigation equipment. Chen found no evidence of magnetic ore deposits, underwater cables, or other infrastructure that might create magnetic field disturbances in the boundary area. Geological surveys showed typical Pacific Northwest coastal formations with no unusual magnetic characteristics. More significantly, Chen discovered that magnetic field measurements taken during compass deviation incidents showed no variations from normal values, suggesting that the compass deviations occurred without corresponding changes in the local magnetic field environment. The Federal Communications Commission investigated potential electromagnetic interference from radio transmissions, radar systems, or other electronic equipment that might affect magnetic compass operation near Point Roberts. FCC monitoring detected no unusual radio frequency emissions, radar signals, or electromagnetic phenomena during periods when compass deviations were reported. Communication systems operated normally, and no interference was detected that might explain magnetic compass malfunctions. Maritime insurance companies began documenting compass deviation reports as potential navigation hazards, affecting vessel safety in international waters, noting that unreliable compass readings could create collision risks in heavily traveled shipping lanes. Insurance investigators confirmed that compass deviations occurred with sufficient frequency and consistency to represent legitimate navigation concerns, but could identify no environmental or technical causes that would explain the phenomenon. Most significantly, investigators noted that the 15-degree deviation magnitude was sufficient to cause significant navigation errors over longer distances, potentially affecting vessel safety in areas with numerous navigational hazards and international boundary complications. By 1985, the compass deviation reports near Point Roberts had decreased in frequency, though isolated incidents continued to be documented by both U.S. and Canadian maritime authorities. No explanation was provided for the reduction in compass deviation incidents, and no changes in local conditions, navigation equipment, or maritime traffic patterns were identified that might account for the phenomenon's apparent decline. Modern navigation systems rely primarily on GPS and electronic positioning rather than magnetic compass readings, reducing the practical impact of magnetic compass deviations on vessel navigation and safety. Today, the waters around Point Roberts remain heavily traveled by commercial and recreational vessels, using sophisticated electronic navigation systems that provide precise positioning, independent of magnetic compass readings. The maritime boundary between U.S. and Canadian territorial waters continues to be marked only by coordinates and chart notations, with no physical markers or visible features to indicate the transition between national jurisdictions. Modern vessels crossing the boundary rely on GPS systems that show precise positioning relative to international boundaries, eliminating the navigation uncertainties that once affected boats dependent on magnetic compass readings. Yet in Coast Guard archives, incident reports from the 1980s document years when the invisible line separating two nations was marked by compass needles that briefly forgot which direction was north, pointing instead toward something that existed only in the moment, between leaving one country's waters and arriving in another's. A magnetic destination that appeared to exist in the space between sovereignty and geography, detectable only by instruments designed to find true north, but temporarily confused by a truth that pointed 15 degrees away from anywhere that appeared on any chart.